my partner in crime, or maybe better, partner in countering crime, Linnie Hainsworth, who's a vice president at Northrop Grumman. Northrop's been a wonderful partner of GW's, of our center in particular, not only today's event, but multiple reports we've done together, and I think play a critical role in advancing our national security and our national interests. So I'll leave it at that. Linnie, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Northrop Grumman, we are just very pleased and honored to co-host today's event in partnership with George Washington University. Frank and GWU in general have an exceptional reputation in leading rich and deep conversations about policy that will contribute to our collective ability to enhance the national security of the United States and our allies. As we commence Cybersecurity Awareness Month, starting next week, I can't think of a better platform or a time for all of us to get together to discuss and pursue solutions that will enable the policy objectives for robust cybersecurity. As a company and a mission partner, we are committed to delivering innovative cyber defense and full-spectrum cyber and intelligence solutions to our customers across the Department of Defense, the interagency and intelligence community, and the federal space. From our work, we see firsthand how the threat is growing exponentially, both here and abroad. To combat the growing threat, we believe that a multi-tiered approach is necessary to protect our national and economic security interests in the cyber domain. This approach integrates enhanced cyber capabilities, built-in cyber resiliency, and the execution of a unified cyber mission with our closest domestic and international partners. In the spirit of partnership, today's event is a true collaboration between government, private industry, and academia to exchange ideas and pursue mutually beneficial solutions to advance policy objectives for the U.S. and our allies. Today's panels are going to be exciting. They will focus on issues surrounding cyber deterrence and the importance of public-private partnerships in spurring innovation on both the technological and workforce front. Later this morning, we'll hear from the White House's Homeland Security Advisor, Mr. Tom Bossert, and the Deputy Director of the NSA, Mr. George Barnes. I'm sure you can't wait for us to get started, so let me move on to introduce our first keynote speaker, Congressman Will Hurd. Congressman Hurd serves on the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform and chairs the Information Technology Subcommittee. He also sits on the Committee on Homeland Security and is the Vice Chair of the Border and Maritime Security Subcommittee. In 2017, Congressman Hurd was appointed by Speaker Ryan to serve on the House Permanent Select Intelligence Committee, where he sits on the DoD Intelligence and Overhead Architecture, as well as the Emerging Threats Subcommittees. I'm sure everyone here is following the progress of the federal IT modernization bill that he authored and is helping to push through and usher through congressional approvals now. Congressman Hurd is one of the most knowledgeable voices regarding cybersecurity in Congress. Prior to being elected, he served as a clandestine service officer in the CIA, the only current member of Congress with this background. That we know of. No worries. And in industry, he was a senior advisor for a cybersecurity firm. Congressman Hurd, we thank you for your strong leadership on cyber and the Intelligence Committee. And we look forward to hearing your perspectives today and your insights. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Congressman Hurd.
thank you, Congressman. And let me just underscore the purpose of this center is to try to shed more light than heat on complex issues facing our country. And when I think of leaders in government, both in the executive and legislative branch, I know I sleep better with you fighting the good fight on Capitol Hill. So as a bit of a backdrop, let me say we're thrilled
Your bar
to
is
have
low.
you here.
Your bar is really low. Then.
No,
No,
my
I'm
bar is
joking.
very
I'm
high.
joking.
And you worked for a good friend of mine at one point, Hank Crumpton, who served
Absolutely.
on our board here. And I think it genuinely is important for those that legislate to understand. If you're providing a menu for people to eat from, you better understand what it looks like. And I think that that's really important. And I might also note your committee, the Homeland Security Committee, and on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. You've been incredibly active as a legislator as well. So you've got a lot of members of Congress who can speak to the issues, but not necessarily follow through with legislative prescriptions. So thank you on behalf of the Center and all of us. So let's start with a general question. I mean, you can't turn on the TV, you can't pick up a newspaper, you can't click on a link, and be careful which links you do click on the net, without reading and hearing about the hack du jour, whether it's Equifax, whether you name it. Every day there seems to be another one. But let's try to put into perspective. Not all hacks are the same, not all hackers are the same. Intentions vary, capabilities vary. So before we jump into some of your legislative and congressional initiatives, can you help us rack and stack the threat as you see it? What keeps you up at night, and what should we maybe pay a little less attention to, if anything?
So thanks for the invitation, and thanks for hoping to facilitate this conversation. And I would say we still have to be worried about the nation states, right? Nation state, the advanced persistent threats are still at the top of the food chain, and APTs are what we have to ultimately defend against, and that is where the federal government should be spending the bulk of their time. And so the theft of information, that is going to continue to go on, and we have to be able to start thinking about authentication and what does that really mean. I think when we look at Equifax and the Equifax breach, we're not going to see the impacts right away, this really is changing. It has to change the way we do authentication, and American people did not opt in for their information to be with Equifax or any of the other credit agencies, and so now we've used the credit agencies so much for authentication. How do we change that? But the growing area that I'm getting concerned with is disinformation, and while it is not cybersecurity in practice, because it's actually not it's not technical. We have to be able to defend against it, and there are technical ways that we can inculcate ourselves from disinformation, track disinformation, and that's why I think these two issues should be talked about very closely. But the broader problem on this is ourselves. What is a digital act of war? Everybody asks that question. Everybody thinks of it differently. We do not have an overriding policy. If North Korea had launched a missile into Equifax headquarters, we all know what the response would have been, right? So nobody knows what the response should be now. And that requires industry, that requires government, that requires legislators to finally work those issues out. Now, there are, and working that with our allies. You have the Talon Manual, which, I've spent some time in Estonia recently, and, yes, there are only 1.3 million people, but, the fact that their people have trust in their abilities to defend their infrastructure, to do everything online, is a pretty big deal, and I think we can learn from that.
Got a lot of experience given their neighbors, so I think that demands they be pretty good at their job.
Absolutely, and look, I'm not one to look to the UN to help solve, a lot of problems. But if you look, the UN defines acts of war, and the manipulation of a utility grid or an impact on a country's electricity is identified as an act of war. So when the Russians, did this to the Ukrainians, what was the international response?
Exactly.
Crickets.
Exactly.
Right? And so these are some of the things, and I also believe not only defining what is an act of war, we should be defining what is our responses to some of those act of wars. And some of our responses, we should say, we're not going to tell you, right? Strategic ambiguity is valuable, and we also have to have these conversations around on attribution. Is general attribution enough? I think it is in some cases. We also got to continue to work with our many countries to make sure that hacking and things of that nature are considered criminal laws. And that is another level we need. That's why I think the work that Mr. Painter was doing at the State Department was important, that coordinator for cybersecurity is an important tool in our diplomatic toolkit. And I hope we see some changes at the State Department to reinstate that.
Oh, thank you. And so to just put a little backdrop to that, so nation states both engage in computer network attack and computer network exploit, peer nations that are integrating cyber into their warfighting doctrine and strategy, Russia, China, countries that may not be yet at the capability of those, but what they lack in capability they make up for with intent, North Korea, Iran. Then foreign terrorist organizations, is that, given all your terrific work, does that warrant any concern on your end?
It does warrant concern, but also, for me, can a terrorist organization take down our grid? Can a terrorist organization, manipulate markets? I don't think there is evidence out there that suggests they have the capabilities to do something like that. But again, when it comes to the digital space, and I say, looking at, I think part of cybersecurity, and where I look at it, is a broader of how do you engage in the cyber domain. The cyberspace is a domain just like air, land, sea, and space. And so part of it is the rules of engagement within cyberspace. And when it comes to and I'll use ISIS specifically, their ability to leverage social media to promote a message. And so counter messaging is important as well. And when you have people using social media, guess what? You're increasing your surface area of attack for the good guys to go in and get information. I left the CIA in 2009, and so social media was not used as much as it is. Shoot, I wish I would be able to have had that information to do my job, because the info that I can gather from that is pretty significant. So not only it's an opportunity for us when we go on the offense, especially in the intelligence space.
No, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think it's fair to say we'll never defend our way out of, or firewall our way out of this problem alone. At the end of the day, you touched on themes we're going to pick up in greater depth throughout the entire day, such as deterrence, such as signaling, and the like. But when we think about our own capabilities, do you think we ought to be a little more transparent? I mean, what good is having the doomsday machine if no one knows you got it? In reality, if we deter, we have to demonstrate. So and I think there's a lot of mixed signaling going on, which has benefits on occasion, but not always.
There is, but this is an age-old question, and it's an age-old intelligence question. If you have access to intelligence, do you use it to do something? And if you use it to do something, you're going to reveal the intelligence and possibly lose the intelligence stream. Yep. And that's why I think it's important for policymakers to be making those decisions, not the practitioners. Yep. So this is a decision if, and I think the future of Cyber Command and NSA. You're going to see NSA providing a perspective and say, hey, we need to preserve long-term intelligence value. Then you're going to have Cyber Command say, we need to use this to put, the equivalent of lead on the target. And they're going to always be in friction. There's always going to be at loggerheads, which is good. You want that tension, but it is the policymaker that ultimately makes the decision on we're going to, the impact, the ability to act is worth the loss of the capability in the future. And this is even more germane and important in cyberspace, because as soon as you reveal a tool or a tactic, everybody knows it, and guess what? It's probably going to get turned around and used against you.
Exactly. And that means pulling in the defensive community into any of the offensive discussions becomes more important today than it did in the past.
Right.
And one thing I might underscore, and it's not to get adrift, and we'll move to other topics in a second, but when you look at the greatest, I would argue, breakthrough since 9/11 on the counterterrorism front, it really was the synchronization of Titles 10 and Title 50, where you saw the Joint Special Operations Command really know when do you string them up, when do you string them along, and when you just take them out. And I think that there is some history there that we can, rather than relearn the hard way, we can apply. And I wrote a piece on a Cyber JSOC with a few friends of mine. So I think there is something there that can actually get the two entities. There's always going to be conflict, but they have to come together to have concerted impact.
And we should be perfecting that right now, today, in eastern Ukraine.
Thank you.
The Russians, look, this is where electronic warfare and disinformation come together. The Russians have been able to convince some people that there is a separatist movement in eastern Ukraine. It's not a separatist movement. It is a Russian invasion of a sovereign nation. They annex the Crimea, which is in the southern part of Ukraine. They invaded eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region. They have 920 tanks there, and they are utilizing the latest and greatest in electronic warfare, and we should be countering that. We should be testing our latest and greatest counter-electronic warfare activity, and we should be doing that to support our ally, Ukraine. And so this is a real opportunity where we should be testing some of our capabilities, and we're not doing it to the level of where we should. And one of the questions I've been asking is, who is the Cyber JSOC? Who is the, I was like, I knew maybe that was a Russian TV over there,
They're here.
They're looking for me.
They are.
Yeah. Yeah, trust me, I'm aware. So that is where that should be the pointy end of the spear. And let me go back to something before we move on. When we talk about what are the biggest issues and what keeps me up at night, what keeps me up at night is actually quantum computing. Quantum computing is closer. It is going to be here sooner than we expect.
Because we're doing a lot of work.
It's going to be here sooner than we expect. And I know Vladimir Putin, I think he said whoever gets AI first. No. Hegemony is going to be decided by who gets to quantum computing first and in real broad applications. And that is going to change how we do things. And us and our allies should be focused on this. Canada has some really interesting things going on, of course, here in the U.S., and this is something that the only way we're going to achieve being the first here is industry and government working together, and academia working together as well.
And we did a major report last year on active defense, looking at proactive steps companies can take, because we can't simply blame the victim. And what makes cyber different is they're on the front lines of this war. I mean, how many companies went into business thinking they had to defend themselves against foreign intelligence services, who, by the way, are not only bringing cyber to the fight, but all source intelligence. So it's a...
But also don't be a victim. right? Most of the major attacks that we've seen are not zero-day attacks. They are if you're patching your network, if you're doing proper credentialing, you would solve these problems. And so utilizing good digital system hygiene is where we should go. And the government is some of the biggest violators of these principles. And that's why I've actually spent so much time trying to shine a light on that problem, is to make sure that prevent the OPM from happening again, that we're following some of the most basic of activities. And guess what? A lot of my work is focused on the .gov space. But the intelligence community and the military are just as bad. Look, the cloud is not new technology, and the cloud is secure. You can secure the cloud. We should be transitioning to this as quickly as possible. And by dragging our feet, and if we have folks that are responsible for this that don't understand it, well, guess what? Get up to speed on it, and that's why IT procurement is so important, because I want to make sure our chief information officers across the federal government have the tools they need in order to modernize and make sure they're defending, and not only defending our digital infrastructure, but providing the service they're supposed to be providing to the American people.
Oh, well said. Hygiene, it's still 2/3 of all attacks are due to phishing expeditions. And I might note that the phishers are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're doing intel once they get one credential to get to another. But you're spot on with that, so thank you for raising that. Let's go to some of the legislative activities. And when I quickly introduce you in the very beginning, you've been legislatively incredibly active. And again, I think in both hats you're wearing, but also in the Homeland Committee, your Foreign Fighter Task Force and all the terror finance work. I mean, that is just rich with legislative prescriptions, which I'm not sure have all been followed up by your bicameral colleagues on the other side of Capitol Hill. But tell me in particular about your IT modernization bill. Where is it?
Sure.
Where does it stand? And what are the guts that we need?
Sure. So two things. Thanks for those comments. But it's also the Homeland Security Committee. It's Chairman McCall. It's the staff and the folks
Brendan
there.
Shields is right there.
Brendan is Brendan here? Did he sneak in? That are intimately involved in focusing on this. When John Katko was the chairman of the task force that looked at foreign fighters, which produced a lot of really interesting pieces of legislation. So this is there's a lot of folks that are intimately involved in this. And then you also have to talk about oversight and government reform, OGR, where I'm the chairman of a subcommittee on IT, where we've done our MGT work, our modernizing government technology, or smart government, as I like to call it. So the bill passed the House and it's passed the Senate. So now on the NDAA, and so we're going to go to conference on the NDAA, and we're going to make sure that we keep that language in the NDAA, and so hopefully we get the NDAA, a conference version, passed the House and the Senate before the middle of December. And then there's one more tool for CIOs to use, and the OMB and Office of American Innovation have been really intimately involved in this process. They have ideas on how they want to implement it, and my biggest fear is that our CIOs are not prepared as soon as this goes into law to take advantage of it.
I was going to ask you that.
And so that is where many of the folks watching or here today can be helpful in helping some of these federal CIOs be put in a position to take advantage of MGT. One thing that I'm going to be doing on the subcommittee, we do a FITARA scorecard, and the FITARA scorecard is evolving from a FITARA scorecard to a digital hygiene scorecard. And one thing we'll start keeping track of is the working capital funds for modernization. And I think that is, if you're taking advantage of the working capital fund for modernization, then guess what? There's a culture of modernization in your organization. And so I think that is one more metric we should be looking at for our various agencies. And so some agencies are going to be able to take advantage of this. Others will not. And that was the reason for having working capital funds at each agencies as well as a centralized fund, because there should be 26 different experiments going on in how you modernize based on your infrastructure. And so I'm excited about this. I always joke, I've been in almost 50 parades in my 2.5 years in Congress. Wow. I've never seen a sign on a parade that says IT procurement, but
it makes the world.
Maybe, yeah,
it couldn't be parades without it.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. So it's really exciting to be able to hopefully see this come to fruition pretty soon.
No, it genuinely is exciting, and I think legacy systems bring about vulnerabilities that are no one worth their salt's patching them either, because they're on to the next and the greatest.
Look, and people understand that. I represent 29 counties in South and West Texas. San Antonio on one end, Cybersecurity City USA, El Paso on the other, one of the safest, largest cities of its kind. In the middle, probably more cows than people. But when you tell people the federal government spends $90 billion on purchasing IT goods and services, and 75% of that is on maintaining legacy systems, they're outraged.
Insane. Yeah, the OEM cost. And two other legislative initiatives of yours, the Smart Wall, which I'm very curious, and also the specific cyber implications of what that could be, both from an exploit and from a defend, from a good guy, and from a red and a blue perspective. Sure. And then also, I was really intrigued with your proposal to initiate a stronger role for the National Guard, which I think the men and women serving in the Guard is an incredible resource that is tapped when bad things happen, right, but they could be so much more. And I think especially with respect to cyber, it's a way where you can have men and women who want to serve their country but maybe want a salary or a lifestyle with their families that's a little different, to be able to do a little bit of both. And you mentioned Estonia earlier, and they have what's called the Cyber Defense League,
yep,
where they have sort of a National Guard on steroids, where they can even support, for a foreign counterintelligence issue, the Ministry of Interior. So they've actually expanded the way we think of the Guard under Title 32 statutes and the like. But I'd be curious what about both those bills. First, the Smart Wall,
sure,
and any insights you may have on the current proposals from the administration on the wall, and then specifically on the Guard.
So I represent 820 miles of the border between the U.S. and Mexico.
It's a lot of miles.
It's a lot of miles, more than any member of Congress. And I chased Al-Qaeda and Russian intelligence officers and nuclear proliferators all over the world, so I know a little something about chasing bad guys. And the premise is building a 30-foot-high concrete structure from sea to shining sea is the most expensive and least effective way to do border security. We should be using the latest technology in order to understand the difference between a bunny rabbit and a person coming across the border. And we can, but look, the border is broken up into sectors. El Paso sector has 300 miles, only 60 miles of persistent technology along it. And that technology is 20 years old. We don't need the Hubble telescope on the border. We just need a camera that can see at night, which is basically any camera. We can use radar, LiDAR, lay a fiber optic cable and use the analytics off of that. The reality is sensor technology has come so far and is so cheap, it's basically disposable. And we should be thinking of it that way. And so all that information that we're gathering from those sensors, and we should take a mile-by-mile perspective, because a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't work, and figure out what's the best tool for that location, have the information that you gather, and beam it to the man or woman in Border Patrol for them to do their job. Now, the cybersecurity implications of that is basically cybersecurity of the Internet of Things. And so making sure that, and this is, I think, going to be one of the biggest debates that we have, to make sure as we are building the Internet of Things, we do not make the same mistakes that we made with the Internet. And so don't hard code passwords and, usernames into your systems. Make sure that your systems are able to update remotely. Make sure, these are some of the basic things that we should be using. And ultimately being able to secure a sensor network along the border is not a unbelievable challenge. But we also do have to remember that the narco-trafficantes and kingpin human smugglers don't have jurisdictional debates in Congress.
The telcos that may compete for contracts.
Yeah, exactly. They're not having Congress. They don't have to worry about congressional approval for their operations. And so the bad guys are well-financed, well-equipped, and that they will be using counter techniques in order to kind of what we're doing.
And before getting to the Guard, just one question.
Sure.
So with the intent, if you see real momentum there, will you also have cybersecurity requirements? Because we did a couple of major reports, actually with Northrop Grumman in the past, with their CIO, and it was on baking security into the design of infrastructures, and it played a significant role in FARs and some of the defense acquisition process. Would that be a stipulation?
So I think FISMA kind of already covers some of those requirements, and that is something that would ultimately get pushed down to DHS procurement. But it's something that needs to be.
But you're open to looking at
absolutely. Look, I want to get this done. And because look, it is 2017 and we don't have operational control of the border, and it's because we haven't looked at the entire border at the exact same time. And you can't look at the entire border at the exact same time if you're not utilizing technology and manpower. And on the Guard, it's real simple. The notion is now that we are close to the finish line with MGT, we're going to start focusing on this. And what I call the Cyber National Guard is real simple. If there's a kid in high school that wants to get a degree or something related to cybersecurity, we're going to try to find some federal dollars. And then if you go to school on a scholarship, you're going to go and work in the federal government for that same amount of time. So let's call it 4 years. So you come to GW or Texas A&M University for 4 years, and then you go work at not NSA or DOD, but the U.S. Census Bureau, the Social Security Administration, the Department of Interior, and because we need people there. And then after you've worked there and you're going to go work in the private sector, that company, like Northrop, are going to loan you back into the federal government for the proverbial 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. But I think the loan back will probably be something like 10 days a quarter or 10 days every other quarter, so that it doesn't disrupt business processes in the company, but it's enough time where you can sink your teeth into something. And so that's the process. Now, some of the challenges. The 15,000 holes in IT jobs in the federal government, we don't have common job descriptions for that. So if we have someone coming out of school, we have to make sure that they have the credentials in order to come into one of these jobs. So the first step is we got to make sure that there's common job descriptions across across IT positions in the entire federal government. I think this is something that can be solved in 60, 90 days. Let's just go ahead and take somebody who already has job descriptions, take the top 300, tell federal CIOs, map each position to one of these 300, boom, put it in a database, we're ready to go. And so that's one of the preconditions that we have to do. I think we have some ideas on how to sort out the money, but the other question is loaning people back into the federal government. How would businesses be comfortable with that? And then we'll also have to start talking and streamlining the process of getting security clearances as well. But that will allow cross-pollination of ideas. And we accept the fact that the federal government's never going to be able to compete with the private sector on salary, but mission. And there's not too many other entities out there that has the scale of any agency within the federal government. So that is a skill set and a perspective that you can't get in many places in the private sector, but you can get it in the government, and it's a skill set that is absolutely valuable in the private sector.
Well said, and I'm glad you touched on the workforce issue and building career paths and professionalizing the process is really important. We've got 10 minutes for questions, 7 minutes actually. So please identify yourself before you ask the question. We'll do two here, and then we'll go to the back, and we have a mic coming. So, Rick.
Hi. Hello. Is it on? Yeah. Hi, Rick Weber at Insight Cybersecurity. On other legislative issues, can you talk a little bit about the MPPD reorganization bill passed the Homeland Security Committee? Government oversight is looking at it. Do you have any? Can you tell us about when it's going to come to the floor and what changes there might be?
Well, he's a Cyber Beat reporter.
Yeah, look, I think this is a good piece of legislation. I think Chairman McCall is exactly right in the needs for that reorganization, and this is one of those issues where the term jurisdiction, gets in the way. I've heard that term more in the last 2.5 years of my life than the previous 38 years combined, and the real answer is I don't know. But it's something that I think that we need to move forward. And I think that NPPD and DHS is so important. They are the belly button in sharing between the federal government and the private sector. They are the only entity that can transition from need to know to need to share. And they are. And that is why I think DHS is so important when it comes to coordinating. And I always use an example of, why need to share is so important. We knew that came out of the 9/11 Commission report about intelligence sharing within the intelligence community, but that translates into the cyber world as well. Well, I've been out of the CIA since 2009. I've never have ever said the true name of the farm. Right, our super secret CIA
Don't
training
start it
facility.
now.
No, I'm not going to start now. But even though it's in like every book and every movie,
Exactly.
it's just I just can't do it. And so that's why culture matters, and I think that's why DHS is so important. But I want to see that bill move.
Awesome.
Nothing that I know of.
I think there's a hearing coming up next week on that is what I think I learned. But Mike.
Brendan's in the back of the room, so you can ask him.
You can hammer him, yeah.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. I'm a technologist working for a technology firm, so I always look for technology solutions. But I'm actually going to ask about economics. It seems like there's very little research done on both how we can make spamming, DDoS attacks, malware, ransomware less profitable for the criminals. And we have even less good research on how we can change the economics so we can get people to fix the problem. One very good example is in the federal government, where we have hundreds of servers that are used in almost every DDoS attack because they amplify the attack. And somehow we've got to get the economics right so that the people who run those servers are punished.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's helpful perspective, and Austin Agrella on my team, my legislative director, is here, and I think that's a really interesting thing to follow up on. Thank you.
And it does play into some of the perception management or psychological operation. We're also seeing what's the cost if Russia gets it wrong on Twitter. The cost is nothing.
Yep.
And if they get it right, it's at low cost, and we all know that they started the HIV CIA rumor, which was all false, and now they're just doing it old intent, new tactics. But
Right.
the cost is an issue.
Absolutely.
We had a question back here, and then if we can do quick questions, so please.
You got it. Mike Klein, University of Wisconsin. I think you're being a little tough on state CIOs and federal CIOs. Aren't many of them appointees? And I think at the state level, most CIOs are appointees and maybe only stay 2 years. Very rarely they'll even stay 4 years. And I think one of the major problems is we don't have continuity of technology management because that position has been made an appointee and not a permanent position. And this week, all the CIOs are going to be meeting at NASCIO, National Association of Governors and CIOs. And the governor across the way is being really strong in terms of bringing the states together and the state CIOs. So could you comment on that?
Sure, I completely disagree with your premise that I'm being tough on CIOs, because guess what? I'm trying to get them more tools. I'm the one trying to, I don't just bring them in front of my subcommittee. I bring the CTO and the deputy agency head as well, because they should be getting all the responsibility and authority. You can't hold somebody accountable if they don't have the authorities to do their job. And so for me, me, everything we have been doing is to strengthen their authorities in order to do this. But yeah, we should be, there is not enough continuity, and we have to look at why that is. Is it frustration with the ability to do their job? Is it lack of adequate manpower? These are issues I'm pretty confident that GAO has looked at, and we have to make sure that we're creating the right culture. And that begins with making sure the CIO is part of the C-suite. You know, there are still many agencies where the CIO doesn't report directly to the deputy or the agency head. That's unacceptable. And so I think making this issue more of a C-suite responsibility, I think you're going to see our CIOs feel like their work is being valued, because again, federal CIOs, they're not getting paid enough. They have, you know, huge issues, and they have Congress breathing down their throats. So I recognize the difficulty of that. That's why I want to make sure they have the tools.
And last question, because we're actually out of time, and I have to be a bit of a tyrant. But with that state-local question, what are your thoughts on DHS designating electoral systems at the state level as not a as it's actually a sub-critical infrastructure, as part of government operations?
So I think you know, Jay Johnson convinced me that this was
his chief of staff is in the room,
which is a good move, because what it does is it prioritizes state CIOs to get support and training and dollars from DHS, voluntary. And so I think the concern many had was that DHS is going to try to take over managing elections. No, utilities are considered critical infrastructure providers. DHS are not running utilities. Telecommunications infrastructure is considered critical infrastructure. DHS is not running a phone company, right? So I think those fears have been misplaced. And as we saw at Black Hat this past Black Hat, where 26 of the voting machines were brought, and they were all hacked within, I believe, 6 hours. This is something that our local municipalities, states, and federal government has to be working together to ensure the protection of our voting systems.
Congressman Hurd, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your service, and thank you for getting things done. So
it's my pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah.
And if I could get our panel up here now. Well, thank you. I've got to be a bit of a timekeeper here, since we've got a lot to cover in a short period of time. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists, and immediately to my left is Richard Andres, who is, I might note, and I failed to mention earlier, we announced our new cohort of senior fellows, and we have a few in the room, and are thrilled to have Richard as one of those. He is the former scholar in residence at the National Security Agency, and is currently at the National War College, or National Defense University? National War College. So, and Aaron Hughes, who recently stepped down as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for all things cyber at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, brings a lot of policy expertise, as well as a wonk at heart, so can marry those up exceedingly well. And last but certainly not least, Rear Admiral Will Metz, who was the former J2, or head of intelligence for U.S. Pacific Command, for U.S. Cyber Command, and has also had roles inside the intelligence community, as well as obviously the U.S. Navy, and is also one of our new senior fellows. So thank you to the panelists here. So I want to go deep on some of the deterrence-related questions, and I think, Aaron, maybe start with you to sort of paint the picture in terms of where and I think that for those of you who haven't read it, the Defense Science Board, Jim Miller did a great study articulating some of the dilemmas, challenges, and opportunities to get to a deterrent approach. But what should we be thinking about? What is missing, and I would argue it is greatly one of our big holes in our cyber defense strategy, but help us think through some of that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And let me first put a plug as a 21-year member of the National Guard.
Hoorah,
a bunch of tremendous talent in the Guard that can absolutely get involved in helping us here in the cyber domain. When I'm often asked the question around, cyber deterrence and our policy decisions during my time in the Pentagon, it was always, hard pressed, because I think it's deterrence theory in like the traditional nuclear Cold War context doesn't naturally lend itself to how we talk about it in cyber, right? There's so many more of the capabilities that are federated across a number of different adversaries. It's not all nation state capabilities. You have to ask yourself, like, what are you actually trying to deter? From my seat, we were trying to deter destructive actions in cyber, and I think that to some degree, whether it was a combination of kind of our broader military, economic, legislative activities, we were able to deter actions which cause destruction. Now, if the question is, can we deter malicious cyber activity across the broad spectrum, from the Equifaxes of the world to the influence operations to the just disruption of network traffic that happens day in and day out, I don't think we'll ever get to that point in time. I think until we can agree on what we're actually trying to deter, there'll never be an agreement in what our kind of policy considerations should be. I think we do need to get to the point where we have absolutely been better in declaring certain things, as the congressman mentioned. I think if we talk about where the evolution is, it's really getting to the point where we're more comfortable saying, here is a capability and we're willing to use it, that messaging aspect. But I view this as a very difficult point, because we'll never get to a point where we're able to deter all malicious cyber activity.
And I'd be curious, but firstly, I think that part of it, we don't really deter cyber anyway. We deter actors from engaging in cyber activity, which is really a political will set of issues as well. And not to ask a political question, but I think both administrations fell a little short in terms of how they responded to Russia's activities during the interference in the campaign. The previous administration was on their watch, and we were opining about it. The current administration didn't seem to really acknowledge it was a significant set of issues. So I'd be curious what you guys think on that. So
something that the Department of Defense advocated very strongly for a variety of responses around that activity. We raised it, obviously, all the way up to Secretary Carter, the Secretary of Defense at the time, and I think he was vocal in interagency discussions about the nature of the activity that was going on and what potential options the DoD could bring to the conversation. Ultimately, it was an administration position to not act probably in a timely fashion around that. We did get to the point where some sanctions and other actions of messaging was made. But yeah, I would have totally agree with your assertion that we were paralyzed to act for the various political considerations at the time.
Richard, any thoughts on the deterrent approach generally? And you don't have to touch on the specifics of the recent events, but part of deterrence is actually having the will to respond. So.
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's kind of complicated, but I'd start by saying that deterrence actually works in cyberspace, right? I mean, there's probably a number of countries that could really damage our critical infrastructure with cyber attacks, and they don't, right? They're deterred from doing so. But the problem is figuring out, at what level to start to get the political will to to start deterring our opponents. So, you know, we've said many times our opponents are stealing intellectual property from corporations. They're installing different things on critical infrastructure. So they're doing things that we don't like. Sony was attacked by North Korea, right? The problem is that there's a real cost to deterrence. It really is very costly to us. So we have to get up the political will to be able to say, okay, we really seriously will have, you know, credibly be able to do this bad thing to you if you continue to do what you're doing to us. So it's that political will. And the way that it's worked out is our adversaries have gotten very good at finding ways to undermine that political will, to put their attacks at that level where the frog doesn't quite jump out of the pot, right? They can continue to do this. And at the same time, they're using numerous techniques to keep our will from getting up to that point where we could retaliate. They're also doing something else, which is there are very, very active lobbying campaigns on the part of our opponents to try to influence our political system. So you'll find so many senior officials, when they leave government, right? There's I won't give any names. There was a senior official a few years ago who used to, you know, rail against Huawei while he was in office. He got out and immediately went to work lobbying for Huawei. You know, this isn't unusual. This happens regularly. And it makes it very difficult for us to develop the political will to be able to respond.
Thank you. Will, anything from your perch?
No, I think, first of all, it's important to understand the focus of today's discussion. And relative to a policy on deterrence, as you alluded to, Frank, we don't necessarily deter cyber actors. We attempt to deter those that enable them, whether it's a nation state or a government or other agency. So it is helpful that, one, the Trump administration's executive order, which specifically called out deterrence as a policy objective, which I suspect Mr. Bossert will speak about later this morning. But I think as it relates to partnerships, specifically between government and private industry, to define, one, the type of capabilities that will ultimately raise the cost on the type of behavior that is considered to not be acceptable as a matter of U.S. policy is an area of interest from a private industry perspective we're certainly interested in assisting with.
And Aaron, because I want to build on, because I see you, I do want you to jump in, but also, where do you see it going? I mean, do you see natural progression in terms of where policies might evolve from the previous administration to the current, or what do you think? Yeah.
So first I want to make sure it's not lost on folks that when we talk about cyber deterrence, it's not always a cyber action that can deter the adversary, right? So we're talking about the ability to, right, and publicly disclose it's not, but it's the full range of what the U.S. government can bring to the problem. I think areas that would help the public kind of better understand what we're thinking here would be, as I mentioned earlier, having some better declaratory elements of that policy. I don't foresee, if we're talking about how we can evolve from the Obama to Trump administration, I don't foresee kind of any of the red lines because, again, as the congressman mentioned, I think the strategic ambiguity has actually helped us. It's helped us to be a little bit more flexible in our response. You know, I give the poker analogy. I feel like it always depends, right? Depends on the situation, depends on your cards, depends on your opponent, and that can help form the calculus of what the response action should be, if it should be diplomatic discussion, if it should be indictments if it's criminal, or if it should be you know, military action or otherwise.
So, I mean, you brought up the indictments, and I was an advocate for the PLA indictments as well as some of the recent Russia indictments, and everyone, the likelihood of any of them seeing the courtroom is zero. I get that, but it signals a capability. It limits their ability to travel. and it demonstrates that we take some of these issues very seriously. So I would be curious, given everyone here has had a bit of a military and intelligence background. We'll start with you, Richard. I mean, what are the tools? Do you see the military tool being the primary predominant tool, or how would we get to that orchestration of whole of government and whole of society, given the private sector roles in all this?
So I would say absolutely not. The military is not the main element that you'd use for deterrence against cyber attacks. I think that probably economic sanctions are by far a more realistic and credible threat. It's the threat that we could make that our opponents would say, yes, they probably will actually go through with that if we continue this bad behavior. So I think it's very possible. But the other side of this, the flip side of this coin, comes from a comment that the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, made in Senate testimony a while back. He was asked, well, so why doesn't the United States respond in some way? Why don't we do something back when these guys attack us? And his responses were afraid. We're really afraid because we have so much critical infrastructure that they could hit, you know, and that's a broad category when you talk about that, that we're afraid that their counter-retaliation would then hurt us worse than our retaliation. Well, you never want to be in that position, right? That is a really, really bad. So we have to do more to defend ourselves before we can even start to think about retaliating or making credible threats against our opponents.
Yeah. The United States is the most cyber vulnerable nation. I mean, that's also led to our prosperity, but in the virtual glass house in which we live, yeah, I think that is exactly the right point, that we are not to a point that we are resilient enough or defended enough in the critical infrastructure area to withstand anything, and if it were to be escalatory in any manner.
And if I could, it's important to take a look at history. So looking at history, 2007, 2008, the situation with Estonia, 2008, the situation with the United States DoD infrastructure, and the ultimate incursion in both cases by a nation-state actor. The response at that period was, we really have to up our defensive game. And from 2008 until about 2013 or 14, at least from a .gov, .mil perspective, that would have appeared to address some aspects of the cybersecurity threat. The expectation between 2013 up until now has been a significant escalation in an approach, tradecraft, by both nation-state and non-nation-state actors. So what might be the solution? The solutions are a boundary of cyber security is good but not sufficient. Therefore, building resiliency into networks and critical capabilities is an absolute necessity, and one that at least our company is very serious about. Two, the discussion, Frank, regarding active defense and preparing those that would be authorized to perform those functions on behalf of the United States government and or our allies is an absolute necessity. Third, the strategic capabilities that, as Congressman Hurd alluded to, those things that we must have, but we will not discuss publicly. I won't say Manhattan Project, but I suspect that most of you can identify with those needs. In my opinion, those three capability sets are absolutely necessary to enable the policy on cyber
Well,
deterrence.
that's an excellent point. And I'm glad you brought up the international component, because ultimately, cyberspace, by definition, it is its own domain. It also transcends air, land, sea, space. We get all that, but the reality is it's globally connected. And I'd be curious what the panel thinks in terms of whether existing alliances are sufficient. I mean, do we build on the Five Eyes? Do we build on NATO? Do we build on the bilats? Or whether we need something new for cyber. So the question is, do you make sure that cyber is integrated in all existing policies, organizations, and the like, which quite honestly may not be feasible because you have different outcomes of those, or do we need something new with respect to cyber? Because clearly I think that we have some of the most robust capabilities, but we can't go it alone, nor should we. And quite honestly, it's not to sound pejorative, but the Ukraine is they're sort of the canaries in the coal mine right now. What they're seeing right now, I promise you, we will see soon. And whereas history may not repeat itself, it does tend to rhyme, in the words of Mark Twain. So I'd be curious what we think in terms of alliances here, and what the primary international, should it be government to government, industry to industry, bank to bank? What do we think on that? And we'll start with you, Richard, and then just go down.
So, yeah, absolutely. We need to have more integration. You can't do this alone as a nation. I think that we're doing okay in terms of our diplomacy. We're doing okay. We could do a lot better. But I think the business-to-business relationships are where we really need to go. The banks have started doing this, and they're making some real efforts right now. You know, most of these businesses are international to begin with. They're multinationals. Most of the corporations that we're most concerned of, I mean, they're probably not even owned by, U.S. citizens. They're international. So we need to get organizations. We would hope that organizations like this will work together to develop shared knowledge and also agreements so that one organization does not hurt itself by exposing the attacks that it's been receiving. It's a competitive disadvantage, right? So as the way things are lined up very often now, a corporation that figures out it's being hit doesn't want to share that information because it wants its opponents to suffer just as much as it did. So there have to be agreements made. These are very difficult, but I think that you can, and I think that in the long run, if you can overcome the collective action problem, I think that our international businesses actually can help each other a lot.
Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a defense perspective. We partner and fight with our allies and alliances in air, land, sea, and in some instances space. We do the same in cyberspace. We deconflict targets. When we're flying fighters side by side with any of our NATO partners, we deconflict cyber targets with our closest partners in cyberspace. It was good to see NATO declare cyber kind of an operating domain within the past year and come to agreement on that, because it helps us plan and kind of integrate our activities going forward as part of that alliance. I don't see us getting to the point that we, at least in the NATO context, are sharing cyber capabilities, maybe in the offensive side with the total set of the alliance, but absolutely with our closest Five Eye partners. We've been actively fighting side by side against common adversaries and that for quite some time, and I see that just continuing to evolve as other nations build up their capabilities in that area.
The only reason I brought that up, and of course but you've got close allies like Japan that live in a tough neighborhood that are dealing with one erratic neighbor and one very big neighbor. You've got countries like Israel who don't fit into NATO, who are also living in a pretty tough neighborhood, dealing with some very tough. So the current alliances don't necessarily line up. Washington loves to look at the world through its boxes and org charts.
Yep.
The world doesn't care. And Congressman Hurd brought that up with criminal enterprises. So do we need to sort of rethink that a little bit? And Will, I want you, it's not to pick on that. It's because I love those alliances, don't get me wrong. And the last thing we ought to do is undermine what's working at the expense of any of those. It's that plus. it's not that minus in my eyes. But Will, what do you think?
I guess I would start, Frank, by saying, as a consummate optimist, I am delighted to see the countries of Australia, as an example, being very forthright and transparent about their policy objectives regarding cyber that tend to align with the U.S. policy objectives towards cyber. I think it is helpful to see the United Kingdom and the work that they have done that tends to align from a policy perspective with the like-minded approaches of traditional Five Eyes. But I guess to specifically answer your question, the question of does existing alliances, are they sufficient for that which is necessary in the cyber domain? And I would refer to the comments made by Australia's cyber ambassador Tobias Feakin, which basically said, perhaps not. The approach perhaps might be regional. A regional approach might be a combination of policy and diplomatic efforts between countries like Australia, Japan, and others. So I say that to focus principally on a regional approach, but underpin with the policy objectives of like-minded countries regarding norms of behavior that are hopefully sufficient.
Well said. And what about the industry role? So we've launched a couple of track 1.5 discussions with close allies here. And the one thing I've noticed is it's not necessarily capital to capital, meaning Washington to, you name the state, the national capital in other countries, but it's also going to be the banking sector. And when we talk about cyber, we tend to lump everything into the same. The reality is not all critical infrastructure is equally critical. Not all critical infrastructure is equally ready. I mean, if you rack and stack, it's financial services, telecommunications, energy, electric, and telecommunications. Others that are really critical to public safety that maybe aren't up to snuff, such as water. But where do you see the private sector fitting into all of this? And I'm starting to see where there is much more comfort, bank to bank, than there would be government capital to government capital. And quite honestly, cyber is going to be led by the private sector.
So that kind of goes to what I was saying before about these corporations having to work together and starting to do so. But it comes down to a matter of trust. You have to be able to trust the industry that you're working with, industry partners, and that's difficult because you're competing for the most part on most levels. So you have to develop the institutions that can allow trust, and whether that's trusted third parties which can arbitrate, or internal organizations such as Bank of America and others are working to develop right now. You got to develop trust.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the current statistic is, but I'd say the predominance, upwards of 80, probably 90% of network infrastructure, definitely domestically and likely globally, is privately maintained and operated. The onus is going to fall on private industry, again, in communication in conjunction with U.S. government to defend those networks. I think what we've seen with vulnerabilities that have been identified in power plants, water treatment areas, kind of that dimension of critical infrastructure. I mean, those are private companies that need to make sure that they understand the threats to those systems and, with great expedience, try to mitigate those threats, because that's what our adversaries are going to target as we, as we progress through the levels of conflict. And we see already areas where some of those elements are being held at risk. So it absolutely will fall on private industry, again, in conjunction with the government to protect those elements. So it needs to be an active partnership, through, state, local, Department of Homeland Security, all of the above.
I would just say briefly, first and foremost, private industry must be part of the conversation regarding the support to policy objectives. And, I'll echo a point made by Ms. Hainsworth earlier, which is it's really about mission partnerships. And whether you think that the previous constructs between government and private industry will attempt to advance the policy objective regarding that which is necessary for the future, I think it's a question that we should probe throughout today's dialogue. But the principal response is, first and foremost, mission partnerships between private industry and government, and secondly, such that private industry is part of the conversation regarding the required solutions that are necessary to advance the objective.
An honest seat at the national planning table, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that the time is ripe for that, and without that, we're kind of doomed for failure. I'm going to start with you this time, Will, and go back, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But do you think we know what an incident? How would we trigger, and how would we know when an incident requires a greater level of response, and not only the incident response? We know what that's complex in itself, what the government's role is in that in particular. But if the events we saw play out, I would imagine, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are, I hope you would agree with this, if what we saw play out in the Ukraine happened in the U.S., attacks on the grid,
Right.
what would that trigger? What should that trigger? And do you think we have the plans in place now, or are we going to be building this airplane mid-flight when it's a little late?
Yes, I guess I would start by saying it's probably not sufficient for me to speak to the adequacy of the plans. What I will say is, if you think about, let's just think about the Sony attack as a case study. And what was central, and I'd be curious about Aaron's perspective, was first and foremost, from an intelligence perspective, was a clear understanding and appreciation of attribution of that act, in this case by a nation state. And it's important to not trivialize how challenging that is. I would ask you to speak to some of the colleagues that are participating in today's discussion about the challenges associated with it. However, it is a necessary component for informing, one, whether the attribution of the activity crosses a policy threshold that then determines that that activity constitutes something associated with an act of war. And obviously, as was observed with the Sony attack, the critical part of the response, as Aaron said, the Department of Defense had options. I suspect the State Department had options. I suspect that Treasury and Department of Justice had options and others. But at the end of the day, I think it's important for us to elevate our thinking that at the end of the day, it's about the political objective and the policy objective. And whether good, bad, or indifferent, while there were several options available to the government at that time, the government chose to pursue a legal and diplomatic response.
Aaron?
So, 2 points. Attribution, hard but necessary. Second, whole of government interaction to be able to define that which is necessary.
Aaron?
Yeah, there's a bunch in your question there, but one of the points I took out was the adequacy of our plans in coordination. You know, one of the things we were able to codify and get President Obama's signature on before the end of his term was really formalizing the incident response framework and the cyber response group and the roles and responsibilities of who would be convening members of that, who would be the asset responders, who would be the threat responders, who would provide kind of the analytic perspective. I mean, playbooks in place for understanding severity and raising through more senior levels of policy discussion, providing recommendations for action. So in terms of coordination, I do feel comfortable. You know, I'm assuming that you know, Mr. Bossert and Rob Joyce are still leaning heavily on that work that was done prior to coordinate through some of the malicious activities that have happened over the course of the last 9-10 months or so. So yes, I do feel comfortable in terms of our plans and ability to coordinate on a rapid fashion. You know, your other part of your question related to if Ukraine happened here. You know,
Specifically the grid. There have been 1,000 incidents in the Ukraine, but if there were an attack on our grid.
You know, the cynical side of me says that we would have been a bit paralyzed. We would have been caught up in the attribution conversation. We would have wanted to have with a very high degree of certainty before we responded to make sure it wasn't some sort of technical failure. So I do believe that we would have been paralyzed if we're going back to 2015 when Ukraine happened. Now, if it's 2017 and maybe we've seen what happened through the election last year, we've seen what has happened elsewhere, possibly we would have leaned, you know, if it happened in 2017, we might lean a little bit forward. But if it's the 2015 Ukraine, I think we would have been unfortunately paralyzed at that time.
So I started out by saying that I think deterrence works. We're pretty good at being able to deter this sort of attack on the electric grid right now. So let me, given that is a problem anyway, but let me look at this a different direction. That is that usually our opponents, our adversaries, stay below the threshold which would evoke some sort of a response from us. So this means that they have operations which are long duration. Over time, they do immense damage. They're more like termites thrown into your house than like somebody shooting missiles at your house. So how do you respond to termites, right? So the first thing which has already been brought up is you have to attribute it. How do you attribute these things? You know, even if you're 80% sure, but there's a 20% chance it's not really China, it's actually North Korea pretending to be China, right? So you have to be really sure. So there's a lot of things we can do, but the most important thing is you really got to be aggressive with your intelligence agencies to figure out who's doing this. You can't just be defensive. You've got to attribute, you've got to be very aggressive with your intelligence. The second thing we need to do, and I don't hear this talked about very much, is we know that these attacks, these long duration attacks are doing immense damage, but we don't have a way of evaluating or valuing the damage that they're doing. We need to really get busy funding programs to figure out what the real cost is that we are paying, that their long-term programs are doing. Until we do that, we're not going to have a good idea how to respond. And the third thing is, at the end of the day, if you need political will, that comes from the American people. If the American people aren't aware, and not only aware at an intellectual level, but aware at an emotional level of what's going on. If you don't expose what's going on, if you don't talk about this publicly a lot so that the American people are behind you, you will never get up the will to respond to these low-threshold but long-duration attacks that we're experiencing. So that's the three things I would say: attribute, value, and expose.
Awesome. Awesome. No, those are great takeaways on that. And I might note attribution. I think we owe the private sector a debt of gratitude as well. If it weren't for the FireEyes, the CrowdStrikes, the Symantec's, the McAfee's, and on the list goes, we may not have had the ability to have the sorts of discussions we are today. So, and I'm not sure all the private sector, based on execs I've spoken to, are going to continue. That hurts their business by attributing. But we had some questions here, and please identify yourself. Wait for a mic.
Good morning. I'm Charlie Tupitsa with the National Forum for Public and Private Collaboration. And we talked about you referenced partnerships, and I want to make a distinction between partnerships and collaboration. Collaboration can happen between the public and the private sector without a contract. When we talk about partnerships, we've had contracts historically for a long time with the government, with the private sector, that those are partnerships, right? So my question is about acquisition reform. One of the problems with our partnerships is that we get into the partnerships and there's no ability for adaptability within those contracts. So as threats change and opportunities to actually serve the taxpayers and change, the contracts need to be able to be adaptable for those things. And this is true in the private sector as well. It's not just a unique thing in the public sector. So I'd like to ask you about acquisition reform and how it would support adaptability as threats and opportunities to serve the taxpayers change. Making the connection with the business and the cyber, by the way, I just did. I hope you understand that.
So by no means was I in an acquisition role in the Pentagon, but I think we need to be more nimble and get the right capabilities to the warfighter at the right time. I think we've seen, again, I'll speak to my time in the Pentagon. We saw the Secretary lean very hard on Undersecretary Kendall from the AT&L perspective on how they could access non-traditional performers. We've seen, DIUX. I stay in touch with Raj Shah and what he's done through other transaction authorities to get, again, non-traditional capabilities in the hands of warfighters, not only on the cyber front, but in more traditional domains. I mean, I don't know necessarily if that requires, change in the codification of law, acquisition law, or if it just needs, if we just need to make sure we're adhering to the principles that are already in there. Because as Frank Kendall used to push back, on acquisition is hard, he would always say, tell me what's broken, because he felt like he did have the flexibility to ensure the right performer got the right contract to provide the right capability.
Anyone else want to touch on that? Other questions? And please identify yourself up front there.
Preston Fraser, Northrop Grumman. I had a question for the panel. We talked about our critical infrastructure being vulnerable, about private industry pretty much owning most of the critical infrastructure. To the panel, what are your recommendations of how government works with private industry to harden those vulnerabilities? Is it through a regulatory process, legislative? I just wanted the panel's thoughts. Preston, I'll start the conversation, and I'll start the conversation by referring to a recent statement made by Secretary Mattis, which basically concluded that to be able to address the national security challenges that we have currently and in the future, that our current approach, specifically between government and private industry, is, perhaps not sufficient. So his point was, and I think part of the discussion today should be the solution set associated with a different model that is agile, flexible, that capitalizes on collaboration and mission partnerships between government and private industry, not within the traditional FAR rules that we're familiar with, but something different. We don't, we can't speak to what that something different looks like, but it's clearly necessary and has been highlighted by our leadership. So we look forward to your thoughts.
I'll take that too. So there's two types of critical infrastructure. There's the type that the government owns. Say, for instance, our jets, our trucks, our ships, right? Government, military, critical infrastructure, and then there's civilian infrastructure. Usually we just focus on the second. In regard to the first, I think that we need to create requirements. When we contract as a government, we need to create requirements for security built into those contracts so that the corporations are then liable for protecting that infrastructure. And the bigger problem perhaps is the critical infrastructure on the civilian side, and we don't have a lot of say over that, right? That's privately owned. And that's going to be up to Congress to figure out how perhaps they can create liability rules, because if Congress gets too much into private business, they're going to create very static sorts of requirements which don't change with the times and with the threats. Congress isn't very good at that, right? Nobody's very good at that. They have to be flexible. And flexibility usually requires liability laws, which make those organizations liable. So if you lose 140 million records, right, there has to be some sort of a penalty. If there's no penalty for it, of course, you know, no company is going to spend a lot of money trying to protect itself from something that's not going to cost it any money. It does cost the American people, the victims, quite a bit, though. But that's the kind of liability law that Congress should really be chewing on and thinking through, I believe.
Rick, we've got time for 2 more questions, so we'll go 3 if we do them quick. There, and then there.
Rick Weber, Inside Cybersecurity. So the NDAA is going to conference, as Chairman Hurd alluded to. There's deterrence language in that bill. Can the panelists speak to whether that language is adequate? If not, what would you like to see in terms of developing a deterrence policy?
I haven't reviewed the draft language, so I can't speak to it.
Neither can I.
No, it's a great question, but yeah, no, that is something. I think you also had it in the executive order that Tom Bossert will speak to today. So the question then would be, in addition to the NDAA, do they line up? Does the intent between executive and legislative branch line up? But good question, Rick.
Excuse me, Jim McCartney from Travincio. My question is actually for Dr. Andrus. The war colleges are incredibly good at looking at the past and seeing strategy and policy and seeing that interaction and seeing how those play out over time. I would argue in some senses we are just looking at, while a new space, we're looking at the same problems just at a much higher velocity. To your point, Frank, that it's not, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. As you see it, what work are the war colleges doing to help try and bring some of those lessons from the past to help us think about, if not what the answers could be, but a way to get the answers? Because I would argue that many of them have to be an evolution of what they've done just because the velocity is so fast.
So, yeah, I like this. So strategy is eternal. The strategy of competition between human beings. The characteristics of that competition changes, but you know the underlying competition is the same, and the same things that apply that Sun Tzu wrote about or that Clausewitz wrote about also apply in some ways here. So what the war colleges have been doing is putting a lot more money into looking at how cyber interacts with these. Over the last few days, I've been to a number of conferences that war colleges across the country have put on, and it's exciting, really, to see the strides that are being made at Carlisle, at National Defense University, at Newport and elsewhere as we start to integrate these things in. There's a lot of work to be done, and we always need more money, we need more attention, more resources, but I think that we're making some progress.
I think that is a great question, because I think a lot of people admire the technology and admire the problem. When technology changes, human nature is pretty consistent. So I do think that war colleges play a huge role there. Last question here.
Thank you. Patton Adams with Accenture Security iDefense. We're one of the threat intelligence vendors that you alluded to earlier, along with CrowdStrike and the others. My question is, what is the role of that community in the context of deterrence, and especially the attribution part of that? Unless the questions seem too self-serving, how do you mitigate potential conflicts of interest, where vendors may want to overblow a threat, overstate a threat to their, to their business interest, but give them a role within that policy-making sphere and also the response in the case of critical infrastructure attacks.
And can I just add one little footnote to that? And the Cyber Threat Alliance, where does that fit in? Which I think is getting to some public attribution, public-private partnership with real attribution. It's having some significant impact.
Yeah. I'll speak to the first component there, and I can say this now, I guess, as a private citizen. There's been plenty of times where the government has been able to come to an attribution decision, but there is then a policy decision to not make that public. And it has been, again, as an outsider, it's good to see private cyber threat intelligence vendors go forward with that attribution, because that sometimes has the second order effect that the government would have not been able to do for whatever other policy considerations, and still has that deterrent effect on that nation state actor. To the degree where there can be some collaboration or coordination on that, I think already some of those channels exist for probably more sensitive outings of certain intrusion sets, but selfishly, it definitely met some of our objectives to see that vendor community go public when the government was either unwilling or unable to.
I guess to your question, I think it's exciting to see the work by the Department of Homeland Security and also the Department of Justice in tightening up the synchronization between, obviously, that which private industry, like organizations like yours, can routinely provide in the interest of all. So in the interest of government and in the interest of private citizens. I think it's important to amplify the point that Frank made regarding the Cyber Threat Alliance and the degree of maturity that you're starting to see revealed as part of that. I suspect that there's an opportunity to broaden. There's an opportunity, I think I'll refer to Aaron's point when he was still within the Department of Defense, that our approach to those types of incidents, we just can't stumble through them routinely. So yes, there should be routine national security exercises where private industry is part of the planning, part of the execution, to specifically increase our effectiveness in that space.
You have 2 seconds you want to add on that?
So the role is very important. I would say that the 2013 New York Times Mandiant report probably did more good for diplomacy than anything that we have done through official diplomacy. And the final point is, if you are one of these companies, please do not let Chinese companies buy you out. This is not good.
And I don't want to touch Kaspersky right now. That'll come up later, I'm sure. Please join me in thanking this panel. We've got a short break, and we'll go from there. So I'll turn it over to Christian. Thank you.
It's been good. It's been a challenge. My head around a different mission set. I didn't get on my soapbox about being in the financial services sector now versus national security. Yeah. It's been good. It's a new challenge. Yep. Absolutely. I'd say it's a weird season.
If everybody could please take their seats, we'll try to resume the next panel in the next minute. I think we're ready to get started with the next panel. If everybody could take their seats.
Oh, how are you? Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Oh, I don't share my.
Oh, yeah. So I was actually just up there a couple, 2 weekends ago for the gala. Oh, that's funny. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'll reach out to you.
I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. My name is Christian Beckner. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at GW, here to give Frank a bit of a breather during this morning's conference. We've got a great panel before us on tactical public-private innovation and collaboration, tackling a number of the public and private sector issues on cybersecurity. Want to also echo Frank and thank our sponsors for this event, Northrop Grumman, and single out in particular one of the people who we've worked most closely in planning this event, Marcus Edwards at Northrop Grumman, who's been our sort of day-to-day partner in getting this organized over the past few months. In addition to his day job at Northrop Grumman, he is also a Doctor of Engineering student here at the George Washington University. So I don't know how he finds time to do both of those things, but thanks, Marcus, for all of your work on this today's conference. I'll briefly introduce the panel that we have before us, and then we'll go right into a discussion. We'll have some time at the end of the 50 minutes for audience questions. First, immediately to my left, your right, Scott Aronson, Executive Director for Security and Business Continuity at the Edison Electric Institute. He's been there since 2009, working in a variety of roles before getting his current position. Before that, worked on the Hill for Congressman Lantos, Senator Nelson for a number of years, and has a master's here from GW from the Graduate School of Political Management, and is also, we'll be announcing this early next month, will be a member of the Center's Board of Directors. Finally, to his left, Kirsten Todd is the President and Managing Partner of Liberty Group Ventures, and also a resident scholar at the University of Pittsburgh's Institute for Cyber Law. She served last year as the Executive Director for the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity that was led by Tom Donnellan and Sam Palmisano. And a number of the recommendations in that report, which was issued late last year, found its way into the executive order that was issued in May of this year, and we'll be discussing some of those issues in the course of this panel. She's experienced before that in the private sector and also up in Congress. And finally, on the far end of the table, Chris Valentino, Director of Joint Cyberspace Programs at Northrop Grumman. worked at Northrop Grumman for a long time in a variety of roles, lead strategic planning, and for many of Northrop's cybersecurity activities. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being here, and we sort of talked in the last panel about some of the cyber threat, cyber defense questions, but this panel is much more about the fact that if you look at cybersecurity, it's a shared endeavor between the public sector and the private sector, and a lot of the oxygen on those sets of issues over the past decade has been about information sharing, about regulation. And I think there's been a shift in the last couple of years away from the focus on those two issues. Information sharing is still an issue, but legislation's been passed. Regulation still exists in a variety of forms, but it's not the all-consuming issue that it was 4 or 5 years ago. I think now the public-private sector dialogue is much more about, how can the public sector and the private sector work together, not just on sort of sharing information, passing it over a wall, and barely interacting with each other, but collaborating, building, sharing information working together across the intelligence cycle, working together on things like R&D and workforce development, and building basically the architecture for the incentives to be in place for government to be funding the right things, for the private sector to be doing the right things. So, I guess, turning first in general to the panel to make a few opening thoughts, I guess focus first on the executive order from May. A key provision there was looking at how the U.S. government provides support to critical infrastructure that's at greatest risk, referred in some cases in the previous executive orders as the Section 9 critical infrastructure. What's your sort of baseline assessment about how well the federal government, DHS, and other agencies are providing support against, to this most critical infrastructure, or the private sector in general, against cyber threats? What additional types of support are needed? Where do we draw the line at what's the government's responsibility and where the private sector's responsibility should be? And I don't know if you want to take a first crack at that, Scott.
Sure. Thank you, Christian. And yeah, good open-ended question. I'll start with the last thing you said first, which is, where does the private sector's responsibility end and the government's begin? It's not some bright line. I think it's a really jagged line, and one of the more important things that we can do is not just assume that the other half of the equation has it. So I'm from the Edison Electric Institute. I'm privileged to support the investor-owned electric companies here in the United States, but I also serve as the secretary for something known as the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, or the ESCC. And the ESCC is unique in sector coordinating councils in that it is led by CEOs. So we've got 30 CEOs from across all segments of the industry, across all of North America, that get together 3 times a year under blue skies to do strategic planning, looking just over the horizon. And I'll quote our co-chair, Tom Fanning, the CEO of Southern Company, who likes to quote Wayne Gretzky, "We want to skate to where the puck will be." It's about looking just over the horizon, something CEOs do particularly well. The CEOs in general, so they create accountability, they provide resources, they set priorities, and then most importantly, in the context of Christian's question, they are a draw to other senior executives, and that is other senior executives in other sectors with which we are interdependent, and with our government partners. So speaking specifically about the value of government industry coordination between the electricity sector and our government partners, it's phenomenal. And part of the reason why it is phenomenal is because we have senior government officials from the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, and the White House getting together on a regular basis when the skies are blue with leadership of the electric sector. The last month, we have been getting together on a fairly regular basis because of storm response. And so I think I can draw this juxtaposition between cybersecurity, the topic of today, and what we've been doing with respect to storms. I think there's this focus on left of boom, before the bad thing happens. All right, how are we preparing, protecting, detecting, defending? All really important pursuits, to be sure, but you can't negotiate with Mother Nature, and frankly, even with an intelligent adversary, if we've got to be right 100% of the time and they have to be right once, if we are not focusing on consequence management, how do we respond, how do we recover, how do we get this most critical infrastructure operational again, we are missing an incredibly important part of the equation. So I can say for the last 5 weeks and 1 day, who's counting, we have been working really closely at all levels of government to leverage the resources and capabilities of both the industry and the government in response to major natural disasters. And the same would be true in a cyber or physical attack situation. So a lot of what we're doing with this blue sky planning is to prepare for when these bad days happen. And I can say from the last 5 weeks of experience, the foundation that we have built of government industry coordination at a senior level that sets those priorities, that creates that accountability, that provides those resources, and that brings us together has been invaluable.
Thanks, Scott. Kirsten, did you want to add anything to that?
Always, especially with what Scott says. Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and for this conversation. So you asked a lot of great questions, and there are a lot of different ways to look at it, but I'll take two pieces to this, because you talk about critical infrastructure. And one of the key issues that the Commission looked at was, how do we define critical infrastructure? And the challenge that we have now in an interdependent world, and particularly in the era of the Internet of Things, is how we all rely on each other. And so when we define critical infrastructure as it's been defined over the years, it very much has these boundaries around it. Scott knows this better than most, given the industry that he's in. We've talked a lot about how technology and innovation can start to blur those lines. And some of you have heard the analogy that I used from one of the commissioners who is the CISO of Uber, who talks about a goal of Uber being able to time the traffic lights in San Francisco because his fleet can saturate the roads, but the last thing he wants to be classified is as critical infrastructure. And Facebook, as a communications redundancy, the last thing they want to be defined as critical infrastructure. So we have to evolve the framework of how we're thinking about what is critical to our society, and there's honestly no better current event to demonstrate that than the Equifax breach, because rest assured, Equifax was not identified as critical infrastructure, but if you're one of the 143 million people whose files were part of Equifax, you're thinking it's pretty critical because it's the critical information that is important to you. So in answering that question, we really have to be thinking much more thoughtfully about this definition. And I struggle a little bit, and I know DHS came out this week to say, hey, we're going to be looking at how we define Section 9. And I think that's a very important step, because Section 9 and what it means has to evolve with the time and the threats, the times that we're in right now and the corresponding threats. And it's interesting because I agree with everything that Scott said about how we look at it. And I think given the industry that Scott's in, and particularly with the unfortunate exercise of what they're going through right now, what I would argue, though, writ large in response and recovery, is that the challenge we have had with government and industry tends not to be in response. Government does incident response really well. We heard from Aaron Hughes about PPD 41, and that's great. We tend to react pretty much when it comes to cybersecurity very effectively, or in other places. And you know, the other example that we use a lot in this is looking at Obamacare. We spent a lot of time putting that together, and then it failed, and then in 60 days we got up and running a fantastic system, regardless of where you stand on the issues as far as technology and where it goes. So our ability to respond is actually very effective. When we look at cybersecurity, though, the challenge we have is what we're doing beforehand. And if you talk about information sharing, and we joked around on the Commission in that we never use the term information sharing because it's really lost its meaning. And we heard on the previous panel the difference between partnership and collaboration. In the Commission, we talked a lot about collaboration because, as one of the commissioners was adamant about, it's about industry and government coming together before the event happens to work together to develop the relationships that Scott cites very effectively. And because of those relationships, you're then able to respond very effectively. But in a cybersecurity situation and how we're looking at government industry, we haven't taken the time to develop those relationships, to take a page out of the Pentagon playbook and talk about deliberate planning, training, exercise. And by doing that, and there's a recommendation in the Commission report that talks about engaging senior leaders of industry and government, you look at and you hold each other to a high standard. And in conversations that I've had with several leaders of industry since Equifax, part of that value is saying, hey, are you doing the basic cyber risk management actions? Are you patching? Are you doing these things that everybody knows you should be doing? If you're a part of this group, and I think the groups that Scott's a part of are really role models in this situation, you're actually holding each other to a higher standard to prevent some of the very basic gaps and arguably gross negligence that we're seeing right now in industry. So we have to redefine how we're looking at critical infrastructure, and from a cybersecurity side, we really need to be looking at what happens before the events, so when the events do happen, we have all of those relationships in place.
Thanks, Kirsten. I'll turn to you, Chris, in a second, but I just want to ask one quick follow-up to Kirsten. So, I mean, the whole concept of critical infrastructure as we use it within the federal system goes back to physical attacks against infrastructure back in some of the work done in the 1990s. I mean, should we really be thinking about, as we're thinking about cyber or cyber-enabled threats, and, you can mention Equifax, I mean, the attacks on election systems are also an example of this. Is critical infrastructure still the framework that, that is suited to the times, or do we need to basically be starting over and be rethinking the way we classify and look at different types of infrastructure that's at risk to digital-enabled threats?
So I have a policy perspective on this. I'd love to hear Scott's view on this. I do believe, so to your point, the definitions are based on physical attacks. They are not based on what the threats are today. So how do we reframe how we're defining it? It's not to say that we don't need support and extra support around those functions that are critical to operations, but the challenge is that you have critical functions that are dependent on non-critical functions. And that's because of the cyber infrastructure that we've created. So how do we look at those definitions to honor that? I'll just make the quick point that at the beginning of the commission deliberations, we talked a lot about interdependencies and said, yeah, we've got to look at standards for things that are life-affecting, driverless cars, pacemakers. And then Mirai Dine happened last fall, and it's like, well, of course, this is about the weakest link. If you can access your critical infrastructure through a baby monitor because they're all hooked up to the computers, then what are we doing to actually look at that? And that gets into a cascading discussion around incentives and security. And Scott's.
Yeah, jumping in to react. I do want to react just a little bit. I think, much like, and I couldn't agree more, that information sharing has lost all meaning. To me, it's information flow, and we can talk about that in a second. But with respect to the question about critical infrastructure, I do think on some level we are over-defining what is critical. I like to juxtapose IT versus OT. And look, none of the companies that EEI represents want to lose the personally identifiable information or credit card information of their customers, but that is not critical to national security. Attacks on electricity infrastructure, attacks on communications infrastructure, that really is a national and economic security threat. And so I think if we're talking about critical infrastructure, we really do have to think about it in terms of operational technology and the impacts that can have on the life, health, and safety of Americans in our daily lives.
And Chris, turning to you, Northrop Grumman, in addition to supporting the federal government on this mission, is owner and operator of its own critical infrastructure. If you just want to sort of jump in and react to any of this, or make a few opening comments of your own.
I would say relative to the EO and what it tries to establish is kind of 3 key points. First and foremost, leveraging the NIST framework as a consistent set of standards, and even just an approach to doing the basic kind of blocking and tackling from a protection standpoint, but then shifting from a risk management aspect. To build on what Kirsten said about the weakest link, well, with our industrial base, the weakest link becomes the supplier base, which hasn't been held to the same set of requirements and standards that the rest of the industry has, whether it be their size, their focus, or whatever you might say. So being able to transform that core supplier base to the same set of standards, and that will then enable the ability to share information in a more effective way, because if you don't even have the tools and the technologies and the capabilities to accept the information you want to share, to try to create some type of proactive defense or response, you don't even have a starting point. So that's kind of job one, is just to establish the core framework and then go from there.
Either you want to react to that? Scott, as you mentioned, the response in Texas, Florida, and now Puerto Rico, and the impact on the electric sector. One of the provisions of the Cybersecurity Executive Order requires the Department of Energy and DHS to assess incident response capabilities due to the disruption of electricity. Do you have any sort of insight into where things stand with that review from the industry perspective as it pertains to cyber risks? And how do we think about these cyber risks to the electric grid, as you mentioned earlier, from an all-hazard standpoint, as they relate to man-made or other deliberate attacks against the cyber grid or electric grid.
So maybe this is blasphemous, but you know, especially as we're talking about cybersecurity, but I'm kind of threat agnostic. I don't really care why our systems have an outage, whether it's a cyber attack, a physical attack, or a storm, act of war, act of God. At the end of the day, our responsibility is to get power back up and running, potentially even without cyber means. You know, we have all of this digital infrastructure that allows us to be more efficient, to be able to better track customer usage, for customers to be able to do more interesting things and control their own usage themselves. All great, but you know what? We operated the grid for the better part of the 20th century without that. And so as we look at the executive order, at its specific focus on the energy grid and energy infrastructure in general, we've been falling back on this wonderful partnership that we enjoy with our sector-specific agency, the Department of Energy. And you know, one of the things that they have at their disposal came from the end of 2015. The FAST Act gave a grid emergency authority to the Secretary of Energy, declare a grid security emergency, and then have some extraordinary capabilities to compel action to get operations back up with or without digital overlay. One of the things that we did, you know, the question, again, going back to sort of the value of CEO leadership, the question came up, are we able to operate the grid today without digital infrastructure? And the answer was sort of. And that was not a good answer for CEOs. So they said, that's not a good answer. We're going to go back to the drawing board. And we've embarked on an initiative. It goes by a couple of names. Both of them are fun. One is Supplemental Operating Strategies, or SOS, and the other is the MacGyver Project. How can we hold the grid together with bubblegum and duct tape to be able to operate, maybe not in an efficient way, maybe in a degraded state, but so that we can continue to provide the product that is important to the life, health, and safety of Americans. And we got some very smart engineers together who are working very hard and have actually developed some ideas so that we are not figuring this out in the midst of the incident, but so that we have some ideas of what we would do as in this contingency, have some contingency planning. We have explained that to the Department of Energy. That is going to be part of the FAST Act authority that the Secretary of Energy can use. And the idea would be not to figure these things out in the midst of an incident, but to have a menu of options that the Secretary of Energy can pull from that are already tested from an engineering standpoint, that already can be handled, and that way when this extraordinary authority is leveraged for the first time, the solutions are not being tested for the first time. And I think that goes to one of the points that Kirsten was making about about looking left of boom while we are also preparing to be responsive, which is something that I agree we have a century's worth of experience of and do particularly well.
Kirsten, one of the key issues articulated in the Cyber Commission report last year was the issue of incentives, trying to get the incentive structure right to enable public-private sector cooperation. And you know, when we have sort of thought about incentives over the past few years, for the most part, we've been thinking about punishing the C-suite when something goes wrong, and we've seen that in cases with Target and now most recently with Equifax. You know, but are there different ways to think about incentives, you know, not necessarily just sort of the punitive after the effect incentives, but how do you build incentives sort of in from the beginning to ensure the right type of cyber behavior, basically create a microeconomics of good cyber behavior within a company and in collaboration with the government?
So you started to answer actually the approach that I was taking, because I do think when we look at incentives, we've typically looked at it in a framework that hasn't been effective. We do look to Congress, we look to government, we look to penalize. I was asked a question earlier this week of, you know, if we just keep on dragging the companies up to the hill and talk about what happened and what went wrong, that's clearly not doing anything. And we also talk about tax incentives, or we talk about business breaks, but this is not actually getting at the business case or the business model for cyber risk management. We have to be engaging the key stakeholders and doing so in an effective way that makes good business the right answer. I was talking to a CEO of a utility company who was looking at education and awareness, because we talk about cultural change and what's the incentive for the business case. And he said that he runs every 3 months a module for every employee to take on phishing. And if they fail, they lose system access for a certain period of time. And we had this interesting conversation about risk management, because the argument there is, as a CEO, if he loses an employee, let's just say for a week, like they lose system access for a week, he can manage that. He has a resilient infrastructure to kind of catch that. It's no different than someone going on vacation. But as an employee, if you lose payment, if you lose your salary for a week, that's a much harder hit to manage. And so that type of incentive structure where people have the consequences, and we've talked about putting it into performance reviews, but that's the cultural. The other issue is, where are the boards of directors on these issues? Where are the shareholders? Where's shareholder activism? One of the key lessons that sort of got muffled a little bit from the Target case was that the institutional shareholder services got around and said, these members of the board should be fired because they let this happen. And they put accountability to individuals. And while those directors didn't actually get fired, the idea that individuals were accountable from a structure within the business was the first time that we started to see that. So I think, to answer your question about the incentives, it's got to be the business case, and the stakeholders have to be making the business case so that good business is really the only option, and that if you fail to do good business, you're being held accountable, not by Congress, not by government, but by those that are actually going to affect your bottom line.
Thanks. Chris, Northrop Grumman invests significant amounts of money every year in R&D related to cybersecurity, as do its other partners in the private sector. The federal government invests billions of dollars every year in cybersecurity R&D, both on the defense side and the civilian side. And I guess a key question is, how do, from a taxpayer and citizen standpoint, how do we ensure that the federal funds are being spent in a way, and how does the private sector work together with the federal government to sort of ensure that you're not just all chasing the same thing from an R&D perspective, but you're actually working to solve problems that are some of the harder long-term problems we're facing from an R&D perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First, doing any type of research in a vacuum or an absence of any type of customer need or customer requirement leads you to doing things that are interesting but might not quite actually solve a problem. Our approach is to work closely with our customers and understand their needs and exchange information, exchange research agendas and portfolios to make sure, A, we're not duplicating good work that's going on, but we're contributing to that work. There's really three key areas that we see as the most important things that need to get done. One is resilience. The concept that the threat doesn't go away, right? It's not going to change, and if you continue to try to build a new hammer for a nail, you'll do that and continuously iterate to the point where you won't have anything left. So resilience is really important, and from a cyber perspective, it really needs to be able to fight through and to be able to rapidly recover at some ready state. Doesn't mean that you don't have to go back and fix it later, but at least it continues to operate. The areas of machine learning and artificial intelligence, those are the key foundational core building blocks that both industry and government have to work on together, because that's what's going to enable you to be able to do things like information sharing and do something useful with it. Because it doesn't help the information share if you have one person receiving the information in an enterprise of hundreds of thousands of nodes or millions of nodes in the case of the federal government, where you can't do anything with it because your workforce can't keep up with the information that's coming in, and then to apply that some type of responsive activity. And then finally, all of this is for none if you can't do it at scale. So the concept being able to operate at scale, and I think Congressman Hurd had mentioned, in the federal government and the Defense Department, the scale in which you have to operate on is not that any industry or any enterprise would ever see. So being able to apply these technologies, capabilities at scale, and you have to be able to do all that in a unified fashion.
Thanks. You mentioned workforce issues, and when we think about the public sector and private sector on workforce issues, it's usually about the private sector taking away the public sector's star performers right when they're at the point in their career in federal agencies when they're having a significant positive impact on work. And Congressman Hurd earlier talked about finding ways to sort of not only bring on new talent, but sort of revolve people through the back and forth between the private sector and the public sector. On these broader workforce challenges, what are the and anyone feel free to jump in on this. What are the key sort of needs and requirements that we see? How is technology changing that in terms of some of the things you talked about with AI and machine learning? And what for for students who are here or who may be watching, what sorts of areas within cybersecurity should they be focusing on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'll take it first. First, I'll say we don't perceive it as a competition between industry and government. It's not a race for who gets the best person first. It's really the ecosystem required to create enough talent to enter the system to help work together and solve hard problems. So we've been focused on that for many years now, from elementary school, middle school, and high school, through the Cyber Patriot program, through our collegiate activities. And I'll call attention to two programs we have, one at the University of Maryland, which is the Advanced Cybersecurity Experience for Students, and then the second program, which is the Scholars Program, at Cyber Scholars Program at UMBC. And first and foremost, the value of an engineering, a solid engineering education, is at the heart of all of those programs. I mean, at some point, this will become somewhat of a solved problem. So A, the talent that's entering the workforce now has to have something to do in 20 or 30 years. But B, being able to think and being able to lead at the most foundational core is a huge gap, right? You often wind up with people who are very smart, who can do one very good thing, but they're not able to lead teams to solve problems. So that'd be one area. And the technology areas we talked about, certainly cognition, artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies are important at the scientific end, but from a practitioner standpoint, it's just as important to have both students and people who are re-entering the workforce or retooling their skills to be able to have more technical, technician, technology-oriented skill sets, like people who do incident handling, vulnerability assessment, or incident response, both for government and commercial industries.
Thanks. We'll open up to audience Q&A in a minute, but Kirsten or Scott, did you want to react to that first?
So a couple things. I do think, and we talked a lot about this in the commission, that the development of technology around AI and machine learning does not go in conflict with developing a cybersecurity workforce, that they have to happen at the same time. And that arguably, we talk about the definition of a cyber workforce, and even within the last, 6 to 8 months, you start to see that everybody is a part of the cybersecurity workforce, and that we're not, those boundaries don't really exist. You can't go to Eastern Market without, an iPad getting pulled out, or, any type of street vendor now uses technology across the board. Sorry about that. And so it becomes very important to look at both of those issues. I think the second is that we have a little bit of a false understanding right now of what cybersecurity means from the workforce. It's not just technology. It's about policy. It's about bringing in. Bringing in other disciplines. It is one of the most vibrant, probably interdisciplinary major that exists right now, because there is knowledge across the board that needs to exist. So to your question about students who are thinking about this, you don't have to be a mathematician or an engineer to be in the cybersecurity workforce. And in fact, if we don't start balancing out that workforce with those other capabilities and aptitudes, we're going to be in a great deficit. I think the third piece to this, and Chris mentioned this a little bit, is we develop the workforce right now, but we also need to be developing it organically through the elementary education programs. And we actually aren't doing a great job on that as a nation. We need to be doing much better at the elementary levels. We're giving out iPads and we're getting funding for Chromebooks, but we're not teaching students what that actually means. And so understanding the cybersecurity capabilities and what that is becomes very important, the way that kids can then grow up around these issues. And then the fourth, in talking about your issue with government and industry, I appreciate what Chris said. But from the private sector side, I think what government will say, well, you can say that because you can lure in with benefits, with salaries, with location, with, there are a couple of consulting firms in DC that have universities and nice locations where they send their employees to for a week. And those of us that have all worked in government know that the value is not those. You're looking for the greater good, which can be a hard sell when you're trying to get somebody out of college. But what we're starting to see from the private sector are exchange programs and an understanding that, hey, your government service is actually really valuable to me. There were a few commissioners who were running very large multinational companies who said, I actually would love to take somebody who's got that experience, bring them into my organization for 6, 12, 24 months, and then bring them back into government. And I think that's also general human behavior. We do better when we take what we learn and we put it in different environments. So one of the companies is actually putting together an exchange program that will do that and also offer loan forgiveness. But I think that interchange between government and industry can be a very effective way to build a workforce and to Chris's point, not make it competitive, but make it more collaborative.
Thanks, Scott.
The only thing I'm going to add, I think Kirsten and Chris just gave both extraordinary answers, so I'm going to leave well enough alone and simply say I agree with all of that. And the idea of an ecosystem, this interchange, this sharing of resources, both between the government and industry, goes to the broader theme of what we've been talking about, that particularly as it relates to critical infrastructure, if it is a shared responsibility, we ought to be finding creative ways to share the expertise that makes us more, all of us more secure. And then just a plug for the electricity sector, one of the things that we do, the work that we do is very, and you're seeing it with storm response right now, these are military operations, for lack of a better way to put it. And we have a program known as Troops to Energy. It's folks who are coming out of the military and we're getting them into jobs in electric companies. It's been incredibly valuable because the requirements are so similar, the rigor, the commitment to public service, and that's true for a line worker who is out there working in the field, but also as we look at some of the cyber and physical security needs that we have for the sector.
Thanks. We can take a few minutes of questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and please wait for a microphone. We'll start here and then go over here.
Jim McCartney with Trevinsio. Kirsten, you were talking about the incentives and how do we create the right incentives. Having worked on a couple of the things with the government, I would say that the government is really bad at trying to project or foresee what good incentives look like in the private sector. Oftentimes, the more they do it, the worse it gets in terms of prohibiting. I would say that the government may be better suited to create the environment in which things like you talked about can exist. But I guess my question comes down to, if those are not systemic, how do we create a place where, yes, there's some negative consequences, but how do we then turn that around to make them positive results for companies, for new innovation to come and undercut a lot of what the current activity is, to come up with new ideas and transformational ideas to eliminate some of those problems?
So I think it does go to what happens before, and it's about creating those cultures of security and creating the business case for doing so. And as long as we just focus on the consequences and the punishment, to your point, we're always going to kind of be reverse engineering and really understanding what the assets are, what the risk is for companies, and what's important. And I want to pull on something that Scott said, because I think it was a great point about the OT and the IT and this idea of what we're securing for national security purposes. I think the challenge right now is in an era of cybersecurity, of information, of infrastructure, where everything is about data. Understanding who is actually critical and what your business responsibilities are beyond your bottom line is something that the government does potentially need to step in on, because while data and information may not in the first degree be harmful to national security, that is how we get breached, and that is how we create vulnerabilities and exposure. And so I think that we again have to focus on, Scott was talking, this left of boom, this pre-event for businesses, as well as all of that, so that when we get to this place, the consequence management and the punishment is actually aligned with the actions that have been taken ahead of time. As long as we just focus on the backside, we're never going to create that culture of security for businesses and industry, and they won't take the responsibilities themselves.
The front here.
Hi, Rick Weber at Inside Cybersecurity. This is for Scott. So your comments about what the Sector Coordinating Council is doing under the executive order seem to be emphasizing recovery. So can you talk a little bit about what you guys are working on in terms of prevention? I mean, the executive order is about a cyber attack, so.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like we are not looking. I'll just keep using the boom continuum, left of boom. We absolutely are focusing on preparation and detection and defense. So a couple of themes, I guess, of the ESCC's areas of focus. First is tools and technology. I like to say the government has some pretty interesting toys, and we want to use those for our systems. So there have been some great examples of national lab developments. One is known as the Cyber Risk Information Sharing Program, or CRISP, that was developed in a national lab, was ultimately kind of quote-unquote commercialized and is now deployed in the electricity sector, covering about 75% of all customer meters in the United States. It's a great success story of a government innovation being used in the private sector. Next, I'll continue on that theme of information sharing, and I hate the phrase too. It's information flow. making sure the right people are getting the right information at the right time. And what we mean by that is, a CEO, for example, needs a certain class of information so that when their chief security officer runs down the hall and says, Mr. and Ms. CEO, we have a problem, the CEO doesn't say, who the heck are you, get out of my office, but is aware of the threats that are out there and can make informed investment decisions in order to protect their infrastructure, but can also make informed decisions to thwart or respond to cyber incidents. Cross-sector coordination. Everybody likes to look at the electricity sector as the most critical. We don't have water, we can't generate steam or cool our systems. We don't have telecommunications, we can't operate. We don't have transportation or pipelines, we can't move our fuel. We don't have financial services, we don't have access to capital markets, we can't trade our products. There are a lot of ways to impact the electricity sector short of attacking a control system for the electricity sector. And that goes to a point Kirsten was just making about it's hard to have a bright line between IT and OT because an IT breach can have OT consequences. And I think that's something that we need to better understand about our attack surface and our network topographies and our exposures, both within our own companies, within our broader sectors, and within the broader ecosystem of all the critical infrastructure sectors. So I think that sort of highlights that we're not just looking at what do we do when the bad day happens, but how can we limit the impact of a bad day by solid preparation on the front end.
Thanks. Are there other questions from the audience? First, Marcus over here.
Thank you. This question is directed towards Kirsten. I really like your concept around business models and having a strong business case for cyber security. You made a comment about having a business case for cyber risk management. I want to see what you envision that being. What are the one or two or three things you would sell to a CISO to say, this is the business case for cyber risk management? And that's open to the panel as well.
Aren't you working on your doctorate? Is this part of your new thesis?
I did write that down.
That's a great question. So it's a great question, and I think actually one of the most straightforward ways to answer that is to actually start looking at small and medium-sized businesses, because if you're going to understand where's the low-hanging fruit, what are the things that every company needs to be doing, if we felt that our industry and that our business infrastructure was really sophisticated and mature, then I think we could break that out. But because what we're seeing is that there's not a lot of disparity between the capabilities when it comes to cyber risk management of the big companies and the small companies, I'll use more accessible language, which is how we look at small and medium-sized businesses. We talk about cultural change. You've got to have investment in cybersecurity from the top down and from the bottom up. It has to be a cultural move. You look at what your team is and how you're structuring it. And if you only have 4 people, but you're definitely going to have an HR person, HR is your first interface with people that are coming into your organization, and that's the first opportunity to create that cultural shift. And so understanding that cybersecurity awareness and education is a part of position descriptions, and it's also a part of how you're evaluated. The third is looking at basic actions. So it's software. It's access management, it's identity authentication and management. I think whether or not Equifax truly calls into question identity proofing and authentication now will be interesting to see, because it's clearly something that we have been struggling with. But it's phishing. I mean, the argument around the fact that phishing breaches most companies, and if we just address the education and awareness around that, we would preserve or at least create a more resilient infrastructure, is absolutely out there. And so we don't have to be very evolved in how we're looking at this. This doesn't have to be senior executive language for Fortune 500, because what we're seeing is that these large companies are failing to do the basics. So the program that I would pitch would be a very basic one to start with. And if they're like, I'm doing all of those things, then that's a high-class problem, and you then go to what comes next. But the fact that after WannaCry, which was a patching issue, happens, and then you see Equifax, which says that US CERT actually called them up and said, hey, do you know about this patch? And they said, yeah, it's not an issue. In this day and age in 2017, for a company of any size to not be doing that, particularly a company of what you're talking about, is inexcusable. So we've still got to start with the basics, and we need to be developing a basic program that these companies need to be saying, yep, I'm doing these things, now I'll move on. I will just say what's important is I'm not offering a compliance checklist. it's important that it's a risk management approach. So it's really evaluating what's important to you as a company, how you're looking at your assets and how to secure them, and then making those decisions appropriately.
I think there's another question here in the front, and then we'll go back there.
Rebecca Koffler, Doctrine and Strategy Consulting. We have spoken quite a bit about securing data and critical infrastructure and industries, and those are all tangible targets, and our approach is effective and has been effective with respect to some cyber threat actors that target those things. What approach would you recommend for such cyber threat actors as Russia, for example, that is perhaps the most sophisticated cyber threat actor according to multiple intelligence officials? Russia has a very unique cyber doctrine that prioritizes psychological aspect as well as technical, and they target things along with the tangible things like the human mind and our decision-making process, whether that's the human mind of the US voter or the human mind of our policymakers. What approach do we use to secure those things, in your view? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that?
I'll start. So I guess the best way to talk about it is in terms of threat actors and capabilities. And I'm reminded of what John Brennan, the former CIA director, had said, those who want to attack us in a particular way can't, and those who can don't want to. And that was true when he said it. It may be a little bit less true today. But regardless, I think we have to look at APT, at Advanced Persistent Threat, in a thoughtful way. I think one of the most thoughtful ways from an electric sector perspective specifically is to understand that APT, it goes back to what I said, if we have to be right 100% of the time and the adversary has to be right once, we have to acknowledge that the adversary can in fact be right. And that goes to the value of preparedness, the ability to operate in a degraded state, the understanding of what the motivations of a threat actor might be, and how they would comport themselves in a threat. Somehow we've gotten through this entire discussion without mentioning Ukraine, so I will start it now, and to say that that particular incidents, end of 2015 and end of 2016, are particularly useful lessons for the sector that I help to represent, because it is an indication of what an attack likely would look like on electric infrastructure. And that gives us an opportunity to prepare ourselves, and do the thought exercise of what would we do here in the United States if a Ukraine-style attack impacted our systems. And I can tell you that that has been a primary focus of the Sector Coordinating Council for quite a while.
I think we have time for one more quick question back there.
Hi, Ian Wallace from New America's Cybersecurity Initiative. When we think public-private, we often to default, at least in DC, thinking the public side of that being the federal government. But clearly, states and cities have an increasingly important role in this. So my question is, what should we be expecting from states and cities in their role as either owners, regulators of critical infrastructure, or enablers in terms of education policies, etc.? And what can other stakeholders, be they the federal government or the private sector, be doing to help and enable that policy formulation?
Well, I'd say in the efforts we've done both in education and academic programs along with economic development from a startup, small to medium enterprise business, the partnership with state and local government is one that without that we wouldn't be successful, because it provides you the undercore and underpinnings of the infrastructure required to have things like a technology incubator that's created, sponsored, and executed by a professional organization that's in concert with the state, right? And building the ecosystem and the environment for which people can be successful certainly comes down to a state and local level versus just a federal government activity. Not to say our federal partners aren't important, but when you get down to the economic development, down to the job level, it's really the state and local government that helps drive that.
Thanks. And we're out of our allotted time, so please join me in thanking the panel for their comments and for joining us today. And we'll take another short break now. We'll reconvene, start the next section promptly at 11:45. Please try to be back in your seats by 11:40 so that we can make sure that we start the next keynote session on time. Thank you.
Good. How you doing? Good luck and all that. So you're the one who's going for the doctorate? Congratulations. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, in DC. Yep. Okay. Terrific.
Great talk.
Well, let me know if I can help with it. But that's great. I think you had a credit. Okay, we'll just do that. I have aspirations. I always thought I was going to end up doing that. So okay. All right. Don't lose interest. But if you're around.
Out there? No, I'd prefer front pocket. Actually works.
If you want to, we can slow that down a little bit.
Yep.
Are you guys thinking
Right now, yeah. One other time I've had to do this last minute. I do a lot of talks. Yeah, usually he's good about keeping his timings. Yeah, when you said you knew him from years back, I was
before him.
If everybody could please take their seats, we'll be starting it again in just a minute. Thank you.
Right? Yep. All right. See you, George. All right.
Which one is not overcome? Bossert, but we've got some. Well, good morning, good afternoon. One bit of housekeeping information. Tom Bossert is duty calls. He's responding to obviously the devastating effects in Puerto Rico, and since his job is to be head of Homeland Security, Cyber, Counterterrorism, he's kind of running in a million directions, but we are truly fortunate to have Rob Joyce in his place. For those of you who don't know Rob is the cyber lead at the National Security Council. He's the so-called Cyber Czar, the coordinator for all things cyber. He comes to the White House from the National Security Agency, where among other roles, he ran TAO, which I think has gotten a little more notice in recent years, and there was a time we couldn't even mention that. But Rob comes to this job with true professionalism. He's worked these issues from a collector and an operator's perspective, and he has a natural ability to translate sort of those ideas into policy and the like. So, Rob, thank you for doing this, especially at last minute. Thought we'd start with a general question. The executive order that was promulgated in May. I know a lot of homework items were due early September, late August. Can you sort of give us a sense of where we stand? And I don't expect you to break all news in terms of what exactly was provided, but tell me where things stand. And then in particular, just because it's been a common theme of our overall event today, the cyber deterrence language in particular. So,
certainly. So,
please.
First question, is this on? Yeah, sounds like it. All right. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. And Tom Bossert did send his deep regrets. He's in the middle of, in the White House response to the hurricanes, both as the devastation hit Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico and sister islands. So working that hard and asked me to step in. And I appreciate the opportunity
Thank you,
to talk in this space. So the executive order, let me give a brief thumbnail for those not familiar of what it covers, and then we'll talk about the reports that come in under it. 4 big areas in the executive order. The first is protection of our government networks. Those networks are the ones that transact government business, but also hold the information of the American people. And when you look back at things like the OPM breach, it's not hard to understand why we've got to put effort into making sure those are secure and modern. And I think anybody who's either interacted with government IT or is currently in the government knows that not every place in the government is at the same level of protection and security. Probably not the case that everybody needs to be, but we do need to make sure the most important information, the most important both national security information, but also privacy implicating information is protected. So the EO was tasking the modernization of those federal networks and thinking about how we do cybersecurity at scale. And a lot of that, looking ahead, the recommendations coming in there were things like shared services, the idea of moving to modern cloud-based services, the concepts of getting connected to the experts in cybersecurity. When you've got the Bureau of Land Management overseeing important things like hydroelectric power production, they're probably not going to compete with DHS, NSA, and DoD in recruiting cybersecurity specialists, but you want those networks just as secure as the other places we have in the federal government. So, so thinking about how we can do some shared services even in security operations. So that's area 1 is federal networks. Area 2 is critical infrastructure. In that area, we're talking about the 17 critical infrastructure sectors, things like power, energy, communications, health, water, transportation, maritime, all of those sectors where often those are run and operated by the commercial industry partners, but have implications to the safety and even national security of our country. So that is a collaboration between those sectors and the U.S. government as to how we improve security. This year the trend line continues that advantage is going to offense, and that's a scary thing when you think about critical infrastructure. Right? We can't have our power grid being held at risk. We can't have questions as to whether the financial sector can stay free from intrusion. So what that means is we have to have both security as well as resiliency in those critical infrastructure networks.
Rob, not to cut you off, but do you see a day where the initiative can actually be with the defender, or will it always be with the attacker? Red will always probably be ahead of blue, right?
I think,
given what you previously did.
I think, well, just one comment in that. I did TAO, but I also was
It's CND, yes, assurance. There you go, you're right.
And I really encourage, I think people have to flow across that membrane
Forgot you were
both
at
to
IAD.
offense and defense. The phrase I use with others is it takes a thief to catch a thief.
Absolutely.
In both of those jobs, I thought differently about the way we needed to move forward because of the experience of the other.
But which job did you think trumped the other? Not in terms of more fun, but...
I would say, my TAO job was easier, and the information assurance kept me up at night.
There you go.
So, yeah.
Sorry.
So critical infrastructure resiliency is important. We can't assume that offense won't get through the defenses we put up. And so at that point, you've got to have capabilities, 1, to find and uncover intrusions as fast as you can, 2, minimize and localize the impact from those intrusions. And then 3, when you do have an impact, how do you recover and recover quickly? And it only takes the devastation that we're seeing from some of these hurricane impacts to know that when these services are down, it has tremendous implications to health and safety and welfare.
Which, by the way, is part of a deterrent too, right? The ability to bounce back minimizes the reason a perpetrator may turn to those direct, if you can demonstrate the ability to bounce back.
Absolutely, and you asked about our deterrence strategy. One piece of that will certainly be demonstrating resiliency. So if you have a question as to whether an effect can hold someone at risk, whether an effect will succeed, or whether it will have the impact you're seeking, it may change the calculus of your willingness to go ahead with that. Yes, absolutely.
And on the critical infrastructure side, I mean, no one will disagree that the 17 critical infrastructure areas are all important, but some are arguably more critical than others. The lifeline sectors, energy and electric, telecommunications, financial services, water, transportation. How do you rack and stack that? I mean, because we can't have just a peanut butter approach where we treat everything evenly and equally, or can we?
No, there has to be priorities because we don't have unlimited resources. And when you're faced with scarcity of resources, you have to prioritize. For me, the base of that pyramid is the power sector. Right? If you look at when the power goes down, things cascade from there. You know, the communication
sugar daddy
sector,
of all. Yeah.
Yep, can only run so long on generators. The communication sector goes down, the banking and finance sector isn't going to be able to transact. So there's this cascading effect. And in fact, we're working on the Grid X exercise that'll be coming up. We always do an energy sector cyber exercise. This year we're trying to make this joint with power and the communication sector, I'm sorry, the banking and communication sector, to look at some of those knock-on effects and make it a little more realistic as to how society would react.
And even from a defensive standpoint, I mean, the old Willie Sutton principle, why rob banks, that's where the money is. Clearly, the financial services sector is very far along. And quite bluntly, there are only a few sectors that could genuinely absorb some of the high-end threat indicator, information intelligence, whatever we want to call it. I don't remember if it was NIAC or NSTAC, but they did a report calling out the 4 critical infrastructures and creating sort of a super sector. Is that something you think worth looking at, or does that unfairly put forth ahead of others?
Yeah, I don't think we'll create a super sector, but we are going to spend more time looking at the interactions between sectors and making sure that you know, all of the dependencies in one are teased through and the threads are pulled to the impacts to others.
And then that gets to sort of the concept that, I mean, we have unlimited vulnerability, limited resources, and a thinking enemy that bases their actions on our actions. So it's not like security is an end state. It's a continuous process. So the question there becomes sort of in that prioritization, anything new coming out of the executive orders that you think can, because we've all heard public-private partner, everyone agrees with that, I think, but I've been known to say long on nouns, short on verbs. We've talked about it, we've admired the problem. What are some, and it's not to suggest that there aren't solutions, because quite honestly, the defense industrial base, the energy sector, we just heard from Scott Aronson at EEI, financial services sector, we do tons of work with the FSARC and the FSISAC, and they're doing phenomenal work. But it still comes to the policy without resources is rhetoric. So where do we kind of see that coming down?
Sure. So I think it's a joint activity. For both of us. Private industry has invested. Government has invested. I don't know that the gears on the teeth are meshing yet. So we've, one of the calls we often get from the ISACs and the FSARC is, you know, we need more sharing of the government knowledge and information that you have. In the classified arena, that's hard to push everything the government has. Sources and methods are you know, implicated in some of that. So what we've been talking about is, instead of the push model, send us everything you've got, is find ways to integrate a few of the key analysts with sector knowledge into the government areas where they can then look for their equities identify information that then needs to be pushed out for action.
And how about the vice versa? Do you see that going where government can spend more time in some of these critical infrastructure areas? Not just hiring them out of government, but...
We think it's important not only for the connection, but also for the development of the government expertise and the relationships.
Awesome.
But I think that the most impactful step we'll have is bringing more into the analytics sectors from the commercial side so that they can have expansive access, but in a controlled way where the data isn't as at risk, and we can keep track of then what is pushed out and shared with industry.
Coming to your role as sort of a primary producer of information and customer of other bits of information, but largely a provider of it. I mean, what did you find coming into a White House kind of role? And this is more of a personal question, sort of. What did you think made sense? What didn't? All these executive orders that we've all put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in this room, and of course you guys. But what really works in the day? Do we have the ability to know in the event of an incident what would trigger an escalation, what a significant incident is? When are you going to get your war room together to be able to manage the consequences of an incident? Are all those still sort of, we'll know it when we see it, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, we've got a process. In the end, it's going to come down to expertise, right? We have...
That's why it's really good you're there, by the way. So.
We have a wide array of really smart folks distributed across the community. So when you look at what DHS has, what OD&I has in the CTIC,
CTIC, is that taking flight? Is that?
It is. I consume
yeah.
intel from the CTIC every day. That's where I start.
For those that don't know, CTIC, Cyber Threat Intelligence Center.
So that is an organization that takes the reporting from across the intel community to include open source and commercial and partner information, and then tries to summarize up what we need to know. So they're at the front lines of sensing a warning, but also the intel community and commercial entities. So every day across that wide array of participants, we all drink from these fire hoses of information streams, but what we rely on is the expertise and judgment of a bunch of different people, and things get elevated quickly. We have routine interaction where I host the interagency once a week. In that, we talk about threat landscape and other things. But with those daily information flows, we've got a process when something's breaking to pop and call an ad hoc session. And then there's a presidential policy on when we turn to a very formal coordination group that kicks off and is led at the DHS level that triggers some very formal processes, communications, interactions with the commercial entities, and even has a lessons learned process at the end so that every incident we get a little better.
Can you give us a sense of what sort of an incident would potentially trigger that? I mean, would, obviously I don't think the Equifax breach, but at one end, but if there were an attack on the grid, as you mentioned, as we saw in the Ukraine, that probably would trigger it? Yeah?
Absolutely would. So a great example is, as WannaCry hit the health sector. Wasn't hitting in the U.S., but we watched the impact it was having at the UK, and that kicked off significant interagency processes.
What about IoT? How big of I mean, you've got a vast universe when we talk about prioritization that I'm sure keeps you up at night. I used to say I get up, I cry I sleep like a baby, wake up every few hours crying. So, but in all sincerity, where does IoT and the fact that our attack surface is genuinely growing exponentially, and the real time to get solutions is probably at the design phase.
Yes.
I mean, systems are systems. For all the engineers who are here, I believe you. I believe in what you're trying to do. But at what point, where does IoT sort of come into your thinking? And specifically, the physical cyber convergence vulnerability in terms of how we should be thinking about that.
Yeah, so IoT is at the same time both a huge opportunity and a huge threat.
Mm-hmm.
The things it's going to enable in our society making lives easier. You know, the train is moving and we are going in that direction, right? We're not going to slow that down and stop it. But as we saw in the Mirai botnet and other things, poorly designed IoT is a real threat to infrastructure, to capabilities, to financial and even national security. So at this point, there's been various calls, everything from do you do the underwriter's lab to certify the cybersecurity of IoT, all the way down to let market forces drive. We're in the middle. We'd like to see great articulation of standards. What is best practices? We'd like to encourage the industry groups to follow those standards. There's some really simple things that every IoT device ought to have, and you know, it starts with it needs to be updatable, right? The idea that when vulnerabilities are found, that it can be updated. You'd like to have the ability to make sure that it doesn't have default credentials and passwords. And then beyond that, the curve starts going up. Ideally, its update process is cryptographically secure, that they've thought about doing you know, an update underneath encryption so it can't be spoofed. And you know, those are easy and simple things. They're well understood how to do. Market pressures aren't always driving the companies to do that right stuff from the beginning. And that's where I think the government and industry groups can push and help. You know, it's our desire not to see that pendulum swing all the way to regulation, which is why we, in the executive order, kicked off some botnet studies and other things that really go back to IoT roots and some of the same root causes.
Awesome. And one other thought, since you brought up crypto, the going dark dilemma and challenge obviously stymies law enforcement intelligence. The flip side is without strong encryption, the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, whoever the perpetrator is potentially going to exploit that information. How should we think about that? And then we've got very key provisions to FISA sunsetting at the end of December. Is there a call for Congress, and we just had Congressman Hurd here, and many others, but what's the call there, if there is a call to action, and help me think through the going dark phenomena.
Okay, so let me start with the 702 first.
Yep.
So FISA 702 statute, it's just a critical tool in the terrorism and even cyber defense realm.
Happy you said that.
Yeah, so it is a tool that helps us understand threats, and it's a lawful tool under close court supervision. It's, you know, even based on some of the reporting out there, you can see that it's well monitored. There's oversight from multiple levels, both inside those agencies and with independent verification. And so it's really important that we get a reauthorization. The administration's called for a clean reauthorization. So since you didn't get Tom Bossert here today, you can get a little of Tom's information. He did an op-ed piece in the New York Times a couple months ago. I'd encourage you to go out and look at the op-ed piece. But it's a tool we can't afford for our safety to let sunset. I think Congress is well focused on it, and we're looking to keep that capability.
Awesome.
When you asked about going dark, I think that, you know, the first message I'd want everybody to understand is strong encryption is good for the nation. There's no black and white about that.
Here.
We need it for business. We need it for our personal privacy. We need it for you know, our protections of the national security side, as well as the way we interact just as a society. That being said, there's also a really important part for rule of law. And so what we'd like to see is, you know, responsible corporations consider how they can be responsive to a judicial order. And the government, you know, shouldn't have a place in saying how that's done. But the design considerations up front should consider that, you know, we as a society need to do investigations. There's a reason, you know, that all of us look to law enforcement and the government to provide some basic components for society. And that includes the ability for a judge to say, I need access to some information. So that's what we'd like to see. Very strong proponents of encryption. There's no doubt that strong encryption needs to be a capability. And then we've got smart and amazing tech companies in here. Many of them are able to both provide that encryption and security, but then when there's a need for warranted access, they can provide it.
So and I'm going to ask sort of an unfair question here. So, I mean, quantum computing and Chinese satellites being launched, a head of state from Russia talking about the importance of artificial intelligence to dominate the world. What does that mean? Are we in the midst of a space, right? Do we know that there's even a race going on? And what does it mean for our tail? We need to make sure we have the capability to ensure our dominance in this space. Yes or no? I'm actually, these are big news stories that kind of get buried in the tech pages. But they're actually really big from a policy standpoint. So what are our thoughts on that? Did that cause you to take notice? I assume, I know it did you, but other policymakers?
Certainly. When you look at technology, there's a history in this country that technical innovation has underpinned our society, and it's also really given rise to the amazing lifestyles that we have here in the U.S. You know, the good news is we have such a healthy set of industries, research labs, academia. There's nobody that doubts we're the leader in technology.
But we can't take it for granted, right?
We cannot, and that's why we continue to invest in that. You saw just last week the White House kicking off STEM educational programs. We've got to continue investing in that next generation, both of the people and the technologies. And I would argue that in the end, if we do the people right, the technologies follow. The people are the secret and the key to our innovation. And so,
and even from a threat perspective, I mean, technology always changes, but human nature is pretty consistent. And good, bad, or indifferent, that has to be factored in. And that gets into the whole human collection versus technical means and all that kind of stuff. So I'm glad really glad you raised that. A couple more questions just on the deterrent piece, and then we're going to open it up. So what can you share in terms of what the agencies put forward on trying to articulate our cyber deterrent strategy? And by the way, in fairness, and I don't mean to lead with these questions, I've been because I don't think you articulate cyber, you articulate actors from crossing lines in terms of computer network and exploit capabilities. But what are we thinking about that? Do you see a day where we will have a genuine cyber deterrent strategy?
Yeah. So I do think we'll have a genuine cyber deterrent strategy.
And the will to follow through when lines are crossed.
So I tipped you to a couple things that are in there, right? One is demonstrating resilience is going to be a cornerstone to deterrence. Mm-hmm. We've got to have the assurances that we've done the right things to plan for eventualities that sometimes are heinous to consider. Mm-hmm. But we've got to do that planning. And then we've got to exercise. We've got to practice like we play. And so that element is really important for resilience. A second element of it is, you know, kind of what I hear you alluding to, which is the imposition of costs. We can have norms. Norms are great, but without an imposition of costs for the people who are outside those norms, who are going beyond the pale, you know, the norms don't mean anything. And
the bad guys have to know that we mean business when certain things are crossed, right? Because right now they don't know.
Yeah. So at times, but I would say, you know, one of the things we've used is law enforcement. You'll continue to see us indict, even when at times we can't bring people to justice. We know that they're, you know, after a public indictment, they're going to stay put and their government's not going to give them up. But it's a powerful diplomatic message. It's a powerful signal to send to others who are considering it, and we're using it. We're also
they
using,
retire, they can't travel, so that has a cost too.
Yep, and we're also using sealed indictments, right? And that in the back of the minds of people who participate in these activities, you know, that should make them wonder as they travel internationally. You know, it doesn't need to be to the U.S., but other places, they'll come to justice. So that's one element. Another element is the art of diplomacy, the levers we have with other countries and the ability to shape their actions. Sanctions, the ability to do primary and even secondary sanctions. We've used that at times for cyber topics. We're going to use that again and more. And then there's other elements. You know, we will respond to cyber with cyber. Most of the time you can't solve cyber with cyber, but that's one of the arrows in the quiver. So it really is a whole of government, but for us it's the will to impose costs. We've found that big international consortiums are often slow to move or reluctant to move to impose those costs. So for us it's often going to be bilateral, you know, finding the right partner for the right problem, moving forward, and then bringing coalitions along, but not waiting for the coalition to be large and grand.
Because this came up in our conversations with Congressman Hurd and the other panels as well. Do we need new alliances? I mean, firstly, any thoughts on the State Department reorganization that is ongoing? And I think part of it is the whole story hasn't been told there. It's not as if they're getting rid of everything state-related, but anything on new alliances? Because when I look at, obviously, the strongest alliances are our Five Eyes and NATO and all of which are absolutely backbones for the United States and need to be. But then you've got allies like Israel, you've got allies like Japan, you've got allies like South Korea, who are in very tough neighborhoods with actors that, quite honestly, concern us, because whatever they're seeing, it's coming our way soon. Stay tuned is sort of those are the practice fields, and we're the main stage. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are in terms of alliances specific to cyber. So do we try to integrate the cyber issues into every existing treaty, policy, organization, or do we need something new, which in part is the challenge with cyber. It's its own domain, but it transcends air, land, sea, space, right? So how do we put a bow around this? Or is there not a bow to put around it?
We need alliances. And, you know, I just returned from a trip to Singapore, who is
Singaporeans, hopefully
in
love to have
a tough neighborhood as well. With some exceptional technology, a strong focus on becoming both a digital economy leader as well as you know, a cybersecurity thought leader in the region. So that also afforded not only the chance to talk to Singapore, but the ASEAN nations met there. So we huddled on cybersecurity, and that whole region of the world is thinking about what they need to do, what they want to do, to improve both their digital economies and their own security. So cyber is a topic that comes up with every country we interact with. For us, again, it's about priorities and resources. We're going to have to pick and choose the relationships to grow. And I think the ones we're going to emphasize are those ones who are going to be willing to enter into deterrence aspects with us.
And have capacity.
And have capacity. And we got to start there.
Awesome. Last question, and then I'll open it up for a few. We've got a few minutes, but any comment on DHS's decision vis-a-vis Kaspersky?
I think it was the right decision. You know, it wasn't one we entered into lightly. But the idea that we have, you know, something with that pervasive access to U.S. government systems that pushes information overseas to a country that has, you know, laws that require these companies to submit to the intel services that data, that's just a risk we cannot have on our government networks.
You know, we recently hosted Greg Clark, the CEO of Symantec, and Russia is now urging or requiring providers to turn over their source code. And fortunately, in their case, they took security over sales, but I'm not sure that's a big issue, I think, going forward, and China as well. So China's got a huge market So I hope U.S. companies think about the security implications prior to doing that, the flip side. We have a couple minutes for questions. Please identify yourself, and we'll do here and then, oh God. And then we'll go there, and then who I can't see back there. So let's start over here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for joining us.
How are you?
Jeff Hancock, Senior Fellow at the Center, as well as CEO of Advanced Cybersecurity Group. Question is really around active cyber defense. I don't mean hacking back, right? You and I share some of the similar backgrounds, IAD, TAO, in that arena, red, blue. So when I talk about hacking back, again, that's not in context. So active cyber defense for across the federal government, civilian side, not DOD, not DHS, strictly civilian side. What are your thoughts on that, as well as what that means for the commercial realm, right? There's been talk for many, many years about companies hacking back or not, shouldn't they, the legal issues around that. Thoughts, perspectives, and as how that plays into the deterrence aspect, right? Because it's great to be resilient and prepared and defensive, but at some point you've got to gather intelligence, you've got to be able to weigh your means, and active cyber defense allows for that. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so I'm still not understanding your definition of active cyber defense.
We did a big report on that. We can send it.
You went to both places, which is, I don't mean hacking back, but I mean gathering intelligence. And for me, I don't understand if you're doing active and gathering intelligence, it sounds like hacking back.
Versus intent.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a very strong belief that the offensive cyber operations where you're compromising a box that you don't own needs to be an inherently governmental operation. So if you're talking about going out, compromising a box and deleting the data that they stole from you, or imposing punitive penalties so they feel like they feel some pain and don't want to go after you again, I really think that's a bad idea for the cascade of things that can occur in that space. If you're talking about compromising a box to go gather intelligence, that still is some pretty risky space because we're, as you heard, going to start imposing costs for the intrusions that are coming at the U.S. And that puts us in a delicate policy space when we're out there poking countries and pushing them hard to respond to intrusions. And if they're seeing our companies doing intrusions into their space, whether it's gray space or red space, they're going to have a legitimate ask to us to make it stop. If you're talking other definitions of active cyber defense, where you are changing your network, you are manipulating the data that's coming in and putting it into places where the adversary may be talking to something that you're gathering more intelligence about, where they are manipulating things and the data they get back has been changed so that it's unuseful or unhelpful or causes them to question their tactics and techniques. I'm a huge fan of that activity, and I think there's some really creative things being done in the marketplace and across the community for those.
And more can be done there too, right? I mean, with massive, anything inside your own network arguably is fair game.
Or even, collaboration where something sits at a higher level inside the network. I think there's room for ISPs or partners with ISPs to do unique things to defend many people behind them.
Like the Cyber Threat Alliance, and some that can actually do this right now. And so there is a difference between cowboy and there's a difference between a public-private partnership where you then turn over evidence or information that others can act upon it.
Great.
And that, I think, is part of that gray area, but I don't think it should be so gray. But that's just that, because otherwise we're going to continue to blame the victim, and we're never going to build high enough walls, big enough locks, by deep enough moats. It's doomed for failure. So there has to be sort of that, sort of like in a football game. You need a linebacker. You can't just have defensive tackles. So I don't know. I don't want to go too far on that. We had a question, Dustin, and then a question back there. Dustin? Oh, sorry. And then we'll go there. Sorry. Lisa, right there, that row. Thank you.
Dustin Volz with Reuters.
There's been some rising concern among lawmakers in both parties on Capitol Hill about the threat posed by foreign adversaries on social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, to sow discord domestically, to interfere in elections and so forth. I'm just wondering, where do you stand on that issue? Should the companies be doing more to sort of get a grip on this issue of foreign interference? And
I thought you gave me a really easy question, Dustin. Where do I stand?
Is it good? Yeah, go ahead.
should the companies be doing more in this space to get to be more transparent and monitor this issue more closely? And how substantial a threat do you consider foreign disinformation, propaganda, that sort of thing on these social media networks?
Yeah. So I do think there's more that companies can be doing, and I'm seeing that they are waking up to the threat and putting effort into it. I'd commend Facebook, for example. The research they did, these companies know their platform better than anybody. They understand who's interacting on their platform and what's normal. And I think that using their platforms and their technologies to understand when they're being misused is the best solution to some of this. When you asked about, is it a problem? Absolutely. Is it a growing problem? Yes. And I think anything that would be turned to try to subvert our democratic processes, it's something we need to understand better and put some checks and balances into place.
And again, it's tradecraft from an actor we've seen in the physical world for years. I mean, the old rumor that agency was behind HIV/AIDS. Now it's just on steroids with no cost.
The other thing I would point out is, every election is an information warfare campaign. It's just moved beyond the two participants who are candidates.
We've got a question back here, and then we're going to have one more here, and that's it.
Thank you. Mike Levine from ABC News. Going back to the Kaspersky issue, would you say that your concerns are based on what the Russian government could do through Kaspersky, or as part of the concern what you know the Russian government has done through Kaspersky?
All I'm going to say is we made a really thorough investigation, and we made a prudent risk decision, and I'm confident we got to the right answer.
Well said. Question over here.
Hi, thanks. Eric Geller from Politico. This morning, Bloomberg reported that investigators looking into the Equifax breach believe there's some evidence that it could have been nation-state activity. I'm not going to ask you if that's true, but I am going to ask you, what can you and the Trump administration do to mitigate the damage from these kinds of breaches if it is nation-state activity, like we saw with OPM, where it's a counterintelligence purpose? They're trying to find information to use for blackmail as opposed to Social Security fraud. What are the steps that the administration is and can take to limit the damage from that kind of incident?
Yeah, Eric, great question. It's clear that we can't let other nations hold us at risk through cyber, right? And if this is a nation state, I'm not saying it is, that amount of data has huge value to intel services, information operations, and other things. You can't make it go away. Once it's been stolen and operationalized, it's out there. What we can do is look at the things that make it useful and valuable. Are companies doing the right things to defend personal information? Do we have the proper breach notifications so that when there is an incident that it gets discussed in a timely fashion and responded to? And then we've even got to think about the underlying components that put us at risk. I would offer that the Social Security number is a pretty antiquated thing. The idea that every time I want to use my Social Security number, I put it at risk by sharing it for legitimate use, I think that's pretty unacceptable, and I think there's good opportunities to use modern technology, two-factor authentication, public-private keys, to give us a way that we can modernize and use that in a way that I don't have to put it at risk by using it. And when there is a compromise, that there's an easy, revocable way. So show of hands, how many people have changed their Social Security number knowing that it's compromised?
Can't.
I don't think that happens. I personally know 4 instances where mine's been compromised.
I think everyone here, does everyone here have I mean, if there were a show of hands that you think your SSN or your passwords have been
so that to me is, you know, the need to think about how we define information, how we use it, what we put at risk, and limit the knock-on consequences of using information.
We might have time for one more, because a question here. And Rob, let me ask, and I don't want specifics on this by any means, but can you give us some assurances that everything we're doing to address the crisis vis-a-vis North Korea also includes a cyber dimension to that? Because ultimately, cyber, again, it's an instrument of their political will, and it may be the first volley we're seeing of something that could get bigger. Are you part of those discussions?
Yeah, so North Korea is a huge issue. We're using all elements of national power in there. We're also considering it in terms of risk, right? So North Korea is a belligerent nation. They've chosen to use cyber in the past. And so we're making sure that we're attentive to the probability that they, if cornered or even if not cornered, will use cyber in malicious ways.
Awesome. Last question.
Rick Weber, Inside Cybersecurity. Executive order also deals with the use of Section 9, the most critical infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about the administration's thinking about how to refine that process?
Yeah, so we're taking a look at how we define Section 9. Today, there's a set of criteria that get you inside that critical infrastructure designation. And for those not familiar, there's a section in a previous EO that talks about critical infrastructure, and Section 9 of that executive order talked about probably the most critical of critical infrastructure. If you go through that list today, and we don't publish that list, the companies who are on it understand who they are and have interactions with us. But if you go through that list, I think most people would see a couple companies and scratch their head and say, why aren't they on there? And when you think about the knock-on effects of second-order things we rely on in critical infrastructure, we've also got to consider that. You know, the idea of what a major banking institution relies on, what a major power institution relies on. Those are dependencies that aren't often considered in that previous structure, and so we're looking at that.
Rob, on behalf of everyone, let me thank you not only for joining us today, but for your public service, for fighting the good fight, fighting it well, and thank you for joining us today.
Appreciate it.